There is a strange, uncomfortable kind of courage that appears in the wrong time and the wrong place. Courage that does not come from battlefield heroics or brilliant maneuvers, but from the quiet, lonely decision to say no. In a regime built on obedience, silence, and cruelty, saying no was not an act of defiance, it was a death sentence. Johannes Blaskowitz understood that better than anyone. He was a general in the German army, disciplined, obedient, professional. Not a political fanatic, not a servant of ideology, a soldier. And when he witnessed what the SS was doing in Poland, the mass shootings, the public murders, the brutality carried out not in hidden shadows, but openly, shamelessly, he did something that almost no one in the German military dared to do. He documented it. He wrote reports. He protested. He demanded accountability. In a time when most men stayed silent, Blaskowitz stood alone and said, "This is a disgrace to Germany." He came from the world of old Prussia, a world of rigid rules, polished uniforms, morning inspections, and a sense of honor that bordered on religion. To Blaskowitz, discipline and morality were not separate. A soldier was not simply a man with a weapon. A soldier represented the state, represented the law, represented something larger than himself. When he marched into Poland in 1939, he expected to lead troops in a military operation. Instead, he watched units of the SS execute civilians in town squares, terrorize entire communities, and commit acts so savage that even battle-hardened soldiers recoiled. He had spent his whole life believing that war had rules. The SS showed him that the Nazi regime did not. Where most officers looked away, Blaskowitz looked closer. In report after report, he described what he saw. Mass shootings, executions without trial, acts committed with such casual cruelty that they seemed designed not just to kill, but to dehumanize. His language was not emotional. It was precise, cold, professional. He sent these reports to Berlin, expecting that anyone in the upper chain of command would intervene. Instead, the reports landed on Hitler's desk. Hitler exploded. He called Blaskowitz childish, weak, unmilitary. He ridiculed him in front of senior officers, accusing him of sentimentality and moral softness. To Hitler, the SS were instruments of policy. To Blaskowitz, they were criminals disgracing the uniform he had sworn to honor. Hitler relieved him of authority. Other generals whispered that Blaskowitz had committed career suicide. But Blaskowitz did not stop. He continued documenting misconduct, the corruption, the looting, the executions. He accused SS officers by name. He questioned the legality of their actions. In a system where silence was survival, he chose truth. He paid the price. While other generals rose through loyalty, Blaskowitz was pushed aside. He was transferred to less prestigious fronts. He watched men who embraced brutality rise above him. He knew he had been marked. When the war later required experienced commanders, they summoned Blaskowitz again, not because they forgave him, but because they needed him. He led troops in France and the Netherlands, always maintaining discipline, always insisting that prisoners and civilians be treated as human beings. He was not perfect. He fought for a regime that did evil. But within that machinery, he made a choice few others dared to make. He refused to become its tool. After the war, at Nuremberg, Johannes Blaskowitz was not placed among the highest criminals. He was brought to testify as a witness to the crimes he had tried to stop. In a courtroom filled with men who denied everything, Blaskowitz was the rare officer whose wartime documents already spoke for him. And then, one morning, he was found dead, having leapt from a courthouse balcony. Some say guilt weighed heavily on him. Others say despair crushed him. Still others wonder if the truth was more complicated. But one thing remains clear. Johannes Blaskowitz died the same way he lived alone, separated from the institution he had served, punished not for crimes, but for conscience. History remembers the loud men, the ones who shouted orders, who demanded obedience, who burned everything they touched. Blaskowitz was the quiet man who tried to hold on to dignity while the world around him surrendered it. He could not stop the machine. He could not redeem the regime. But he tried to salvage a fragment of humanity in a sea of brutality. Sometimes the bravest act is not to fight. Sometimes, the bravest act is to refuse. Tonight, we go back to occupied Poland, to the forests where gunshots echoed and smoke rose, to the desk where one man picked up a pen and wrote reports no one wanted to read. This is the entire history of Johannes Blaskowitz, a general who obeyed the army but refused to obey cruelty. Before we pause for a moment. Where are you right now? Are you curled up somewhere warm, listening as the day finally slows down? Or are you still awake past midnight, letting history fill the quiet? And what time is it where you are? Early morning, late night, or somewhere beautifully in between? I like imagining these stories travelling across miles and hours to reach someone sitting in the dark, letting the past whisper to them. And if these slow, deep journeys into history give you space to think, to breathe, or to drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. It shows me that someone out there values storytelling that doesn't rush, and it keeps me inspired to come back and make the next chapter for you. East Prussia, 1883. Snow falls on the modest estate at Paterswolde, a landscape of frozen fields and dark forests where military tradition runs deeper than the roots of ancient oak trees. In a stone house barely warmer than the winter outside, a child enters a world already mapped for him by generations of service, duty, and iron discipline. Johannes Albrecht Blaskowitz arrives not into wealth or nobility, but into something the Prussian military caste values far more: the expectation of honourable service. His father serves as a Protestant pastor with military connections, his family tree adorned with officers who bled for Brandenburg, for Prussia, for ideas about duty that will seem quaint and dangerous in equal measure by the time this infant reaches old age. The boy grows straight-backed and serious in a world where childhood ends early and sentiment counts as weakness. By 1901, 18-year-old Johannes enters the Prussian Cadet Corps, that legendary forge where farmers' sons and minor gentry's children are hammered into interchangeable parts of a military machine. The training grounds at Wallstatt echo with commands unchanged since Frederick the Great drilled his armies into the most feared force in Europe. Young, Blaskowitz learns to march in formations older than his grandfather, to recite regulations that treat honour and obedience as synonyms, to understand that a Prussian officer's word is more sacred than any written contract. The code they drill into him seems simple. Error, honour above all things. Flict, duty without question. Service to the state, elevated to the realm of religious devotion. But like all simple codes, it contains contradictions that won't reveal themselves until tested by impossible choices. August 1914. The Great War explodes across Europe like a shell bursting in a crowded trench, and 31-year-old company commander Blaskowitz marches into East Prussia to face the Russian invasion. At the Battle of Gumbinnen on August 20th, he experiences his first taste of industrial warfare, where Prussian discipline collides with machine guns and massed artillery. The company he commands fights with the steadiness expected of professionals, but the casualties pile like cordwood, and the screaming of wounded horses mixes with the screaming of wounded men in a symphony of mechanized slaughter. This isn't the clean, decisive warfare of Prussian legend. It's grinding, exhausting, murderous chaos that devours regiments in hours. Yet Blaskowitz performs his duty with a cold competence that will define his career, earning his Iron Cross First Class not through heroic charges but through the unglamorous work of keeping men alive and fighting when everything human screams to run. 4 years of that hell temper him into something harder and more certain. The Western Front becomes his classroom in modern warfare's brutal pedagogy, where officers learn that bravery counts for nothing against artillery barrages, that élan gets men killed, that only meticulous organisation and iron nerves keep units functional in the storm of steel. Blaskowitz rises steadily through merit, not through connections or political manoeuvring, becoming the kind of officer the old Imperial Army, prized, competent, unflappable, utterly reliable. He asks nothing for himself except the chance to serve competently. He plays no favourites, tolerates no corruption, maintains standards even when the war is clearly lost and German armies bleed white in the trenches of France. By November 1918, when revolution sweeps through Germany and Kaiser Wilhelm flees to exile in Holland, Major Blaskowitz has absorbed a worldview as rigid and unshakable as Krupp steel. The collapse of Imperial Germany shatters his world with the finality of an artillery shell demolishing a cathedral. The Treaty of Versailles reduces the once mighty German army to a humiliated constabulary of 100,000 men, forbidden tanks, forbidden aircraft, forbidden even the right to defend German soil with adequate numbers. Blaskowitz survives the massive demobilization because officers like him, apolitical professionals without aristocratic pretensions, represent exactly what the new Reichswehr needs. In the bitter years of the Weimar Republic, he serves in a military force that must maintain professional standards while occupation forces control the Rhineland, and inflation turns life savings into worthless paper. He watches political extremists, both communist and nationalist, battle in German streets, while the army he serves is forbidden to intervene. The Freikorps paramilitaries, those violent free companies of demobilized soldiers, conduct their brutal border wars in the east, and Blaskowitz serves briefly in this murky world where military discipline blurs into political violence. Through the chaos of the 1920s, Blaskowitz clings to the code drilled into him at Wallstatt. The Reichswehr becomes an island of professional competence in a sea of political madness, its 100,000 carefully selected officers and men training with an intensity that compensates for forbidden numbers. They study the Great War's lessons with scholarly precision, preparing for a future that may never come, maintaining standards, because standards are all they have left. Blaskowitz rises slowly through this elite force, commanding companies, then battalions, his efficiency reports praising his tactical competence and complete political neutrality. He doesn't involve himself in the political conspiracies that riddle the officer corps. He doesn't join the secret societies plotting Germany's military resurrection. He simply does his job with the thoroughness of a man who believes that competent service is its own justification, its own honour, its own end. But the world outside the barracks gates is transforming into something his Prussian code never anticipated. The Great Depression strikes Germany with catastrophic force, putting 6 million out of work and making democratic government look like expensive failure. In the streets, communists and National Socialists battle with clubs and guns, while the Reichswehr watches from its barracks, forbidden by law and by its own apolitical traditions from choosing sides. Blaskowitz, now a senior officer, continues drilling troops and studying tactical manuals, as if competence alone could hold back the tide of extremism drowning German politics. He seems to believe, with the faith of a career officer who has known nothing but military service since age 18, that professionalism transcends politics, that an apolitical army can serve any government loyally as long as it serves competently. January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, and the calculus changes overnight. The Nazi Party's victory represents everything the old Prussian military caste distrusts: mob politics, racial ideology, the elevation of party loyalty above professional competence. Yet Hitler offers what the Reichswehr has dreamed of since Versailles: rearmament, expansion, the restoration of German military power. The officer corps faces an impossible choice disguised as an opportunity. To accept Hitler means abandoning political neutrality, swearing loyalty to a man rather than a constitution, allowing party ideology to infect professional military culture. To refuse Hitler means remaining forever a token force, watching Germany's enemies grow stronger while the Reichswehr rusts in its undersized barracks. For most officers, including 50-year-old Johannes Blaskowitz, the choice seems obvious. Germany needs a strong military, and only Hitler promises to build one. The compromise seems manageable at first. The officer corps convinces itself that it can use Hitler's political power to rebuild the military while maintaining its own professional autonomy, that rearmament need not mean Nazification, that a clear line separates military professionalism from political ideology. Blaskowitz epitomizes this wishful thinking, remaining meticulously apolitical, even as the army he serves increasingly serves a totalitarian regime. He never joins the Nazi Party, never adopts its ideology, never makes the passionate declarations of loyalty that characterize true believers. He simply continues doing what he has done since 1901, his duty as a Prussian officer, competently and without complaint. In 1935, When Hitler openly violates Versailles by reintroducing conscription, Blaskowitz receives promotion to Major General and command of the 14th Infantry Division in Dresden. It's a prestigious posting, recognition of his competence and reliability. Yet the seeds of catastrophe are already germinating in soil the old Prussians don't recognize as poisoned. The army Blaskowitz serves is changing faster than he seems to realize, expanding from 100,000 to millions in just a few years, diluting professional standards with hastily trained new officers who know Nazi ideology better than they know tactics. The SS, that parallel military force sworn to Hitler personally, grows from a party, militia, into armed divisions that answer to Heinrich Himmler, not the Wehrmacht command. The old boundaries between military and political authority erode with every passing month, and officers like Blaskowitz, raised to believe in clear hierarchies and clean chains of command, don't grasp how thoroughly their professional code is being corrupted. He has spent 34 years learning to serve competently, to obey legitimate authority, to separate personal morality from professional duty. That training, that entire worldview, has prepared him for many things. It has not prepared him for what comes next, for the collision between Prussian honour and Nazi atrocity, for the moment when competent service becomes complicity in evil. Berlin, February 3rd, 1933. Snow dusts the streets outside the home of General Kurt von Hammerstein-Eckwood, where Adolf Hitler, Chancellor for exactly 4 days, meets with Germany's military leadership for the first time. The generals arrive in their dress uniforms, these aging veterans of the Great War, sceptical of the Austrian corporal who commands them to sit and listen. Hitler paces the room like a caged animal, his voice rising and falling in that hypnotic cadence that has already mesmerized millions, and he makes them a promise that overrides every reservation: unlimited rearmament, the destruction of Versailles, the restoration of German military might. Defense Minister Werner von Blomberg listens with barely concealed excitement. General Walther von Reichenau, a convinced Nazi sympathizer, nods approval. Others, including the host Hammerstein, maintain stony faces that reveal nothing. But in that room, on that winter evening, the Wehrmacht's Faustian bargain takes shape. Hitler gets their obedience, and they get their army back. The military's enthusiasm for this devil's bargain reveals how thoroughly humiliation has corrupted professional judgment. For 14 years since Versailles, the Reichswehr has chafed under restrictions designed to prevent German military resurgence. No tanks, no military aircraft, no general staff, an army limited to 100,000 long-service volunteers. Officers have watched France and Poland maintain forces 5 times larger, have endured the shame of occupation, have seen their institution reduced to ceremonial irrelevance. Hitler offers them resurrection, and they accept with the relief of drowning men grabbing a rope, not noticing that the rope is attached to an anchor. The old guard convinces itself that it can control this vulgar Austrian, can use Nazi political power to rebuild the military while maintaining institutional autonomy. General Ludwig Beck, the army chief of staff, and a man of deep moral seriousness, believes the arrangement can work. If Beck believes it, officers like Blaskowitz reason, then surely it's possible. The price reveals itself in stages, each compromise seeming small until the sum becomes unbearable. June 30th, 1934. The Night of the Long Knives. Hitler orders the SS to murder the leadership of his own stormtroopers, the SA, whose leader Ernst Röhm has demanded that the brown-shirted party militia replace the Reichswehr as Germany's military force. The SS kills Röhm, kills dozens of SA leaders, and for good measure murders 2 German army generals whose political positions annoy: General Kurt von Schleicher, the former Chancellor, and General Ferdinand von Bredow. The Wehrmacht says nothing. Defense Minister Blomberg publicly thanks Hitler for eliminating the SA threat. General von Reichenau, commanding in Bavaria where the killings are concentrated, provides logistical support to the SS death squads. The officer corps, relieved that the undisciplined SA rabble won't replace them, swallows the murder of their own generals without a single formal protest. August 2nd, 1934. President Paul von Hindenburg, the last link to the old Imperial Germany, dies at age 86. Hitler immediately combines the offices of President and Chancellor, making himself absolute dictator, and demands a new military oath. The old Reichswehr oath pledged loyalty to the Constitution and the German people. The new oath is personal, direct, binding. I swear by God, this sacred oath, that I will render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and people, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, and will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath. Officers across Germany, including Johannes Blaskowitz, swear this oath in solemn ceremonies. For men trained in Prussian military tradition, where an officer's oath is more sacred than life itself, these words become chains. They have sworn unconditional obedience to a man, not to abstract ideals or constitutional principles. Breaking this oath means not just military disobedience, but personal dishonour, a violation of everything they've been taught to hold sacred. The rearmament proceeds with dizzying speed. March 1935. Hitler openly announces conscription, tearing up the Versailles Treaty's military clauses. The Wehrmacht explodes from 100,000 to over 500,000 within a year, heading toward millions. Blaskowitz, promoted to Major General, takes command of the 14th Infantry Division in Dresden, one of dozens of new divisions materializing from the expansion. Tank factories appear where the Treaty of Versailles forbade even manufacturing trucks with military potential. The Luftwaffe, Germany's new air force, emerges fully formed under Hermann Göring's command, equipped with modern aircraft developed in secret during the Weimar years. Young Germans flood recruiting stations, eager to serve in the restored military. The officer corps watches this resurrection with satisfaction bordering on intoxication, convinced they've navigated the political minefield successfully. But the expansion dilutes everything the old Reichswehr represented. The 100,000-man force was elite, every soldier carefully selected and trained to Prussian standards of excellence. The new Wehrmacht of millions absorbs anyone who can hold a rifle, flooding the ranks with hastily trained recruits and the officer corps with men who learned Nazi ideology in the Hitler Youth before they learned military tactics. Young officers arrive who have never known a Germany without swastikas, who see loyalty to Hitler as identical to loyalty to Germany. The old Prussian values, honour and duty and service to the state, become confused with Nazi racial ideology and absolute obedience to the Führer. Blaskowitz, now in his 50s, continues to embody the old code, remaining meticulously apolitical, never joining the party, focusing entirely on training his division to professional standards. He seems not to notice that he's becoming an anachronism in his own army. February 1938 brings the Blomberg-Fritsch affair, and the illusion of military autonomy shatters completely. Defence Minister Blomberg marries a woman with a prostitution conviction in her past. The scandal forces his resignation. Army Commander-in-Chief Werner von Fritsch faces fabricated homosexuality charges created by Heinrich Himmler's SS. The generals expect Hitler to appoint one of them to replace Blomberg. Instead, Hitler abolishes the War Ministry entirely, creates the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, under the reliably subservient Wilhelm Keitel, and takes personal command of all German armed forces. Fritsch is forced out despite the charges being proven false. General Beck, the Army Chief of Staff and last significant voice of institutional resistance, writes memorandum after memorandum arguing against Hitler's war plans. By August 1938, Beck resigns in frustrated protest, and Hitler replaces him with the compliant Franz Halder. The purge is complete. The Wehrmacht is now Hitler's personal instrument. Through all this, Blaskowitz advances steadily upward, his career trajectory proof that apolitical competence still has value in the Nazified Wehrmacht. He's promoted to Lieutenant General in 1936, then General of Infantry in 1938. By the time war clouds gather over Poland in the summer of 1939, 56-year-old Johannes Blaskowitz commands the 8th Army, a frontline fighting force of 3 corps and 9 divisions. His superiors value him precisely because he's not a Nazi. He's a professional soldier who will execute orders with maximum efficiency and minimum political drama. He trains his army with the thoroughness expected of a Prussian general, drilling combined arms tactics and mobile warfare, preparing his men for the campaign everyone knows is coming. He seems to believe, with the faith of a man who has known only military service for 38 years, that his duty is to command competently, that political questions belong to politicians, that a soldier's honour lies in professional excellence. He doesn't yet understand that in Hitler's Germany, there's no such thing as apolitical military service, no clean separation between professional competence and moral complicity. The Wehrmacht that will invade Poland isn't just an army. It's the armoured fist of a genocidal ideology. Following behind Blaskowitz's advancing divisions will come other forces, special units that don't answer to military command, that operate under different rules for different purposes. The SS has been preparing for Poland with the same thoroughness that Blaskowitz has been drilling his infantry, but their training focuses on targets that don't appear on military maps. Jews, intellectuals, priests, anyone the Nazi racial ideology designates as subhuman or dangerous. Heinrich Himmler's Einsatzgruppen, special task forces of SS and police, have spent months preparing for operations that have nothing to do with defeating the Polish army and everything to do with terrorizing the Polish population into submission. August 31st, 1939, Hitler gives the order. Blaskowitz's 8th Army moves into final positions along the Polish border, part of the massive force that will demonstrate the Wehrmacht's new doctrine of blitzkrieg to an astonished world. The soldiers check their weapons and write last letters home. The officers study their maps and review objectives. Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding general, makes final inspections and ensures his army is ready for battle. He's a professional soldier about to execute a professional military operation. He believes he knows what war looks like, what armies do, what his duty requires. In this belief, like so many others the old Prussians have clung to, he is catastrophically wrong. The campaign about to begin will teach him that in Hitler's war, military operations and mass murder are not separate activities but intertwined, parts of a single ideological project. And it will force him to choose between the obedience he swore in his oath and the honour that oath was supposed to represent. September 1st, 1939, 4:45 in the morning. Along 1,000 kilometres of German-Polish border, artillery opens fire with a roar that can be heard in Warsaw. In the south, Johannes Blaskowitz's 8th Army surges across the frontier near Częstochowa, 3 corps strong, tanks and motorised infantry, moving at speeds that would have seemed impossible in the Great War. The Polish army, brave but hopelessly outmatched, tries to defend everywhere and succeeds nowhere. German Stukas scream down from clear skies, pulverising Polish strong points, while the Luftwaffe destroys the Polish Air Force on the ground. Within hours, Blaskowitz's divisions penetrate 20 kilometres into Polish territory. Within days, they've ripped apart Polish defensive positions and are racing toward Łódź. This is blitzkrieg, lightning war, the doctrine the Wehrmacht has spent years perfecting, and it works with terrifying efficiency. For Blaskowitz and his officers, these first days bring the intoxication of military success. The 8th Army functions like the precision instrument. It was trained to be combined arms teams of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support, overwhelming Polish resistance through speed and coordination. September 8th. Blaskowitz's lead elements enter Łódź, Poland's second largest city, after a brilliant encirclement manoeuvre. Polish forces dissolve before the German advance, divisions cut off and surrounded, command and control shattered by the pace of operations. By mid-September, Blaskowitz's 8th Army and the rest of Army Group South have advanced over 200 kilometres, captured more than 170,000 prisoners, and effectively destroyed organised Polish resistance in their sector. For an officer trained in Prussian military tradition, these results represent vindication. Careful training, professional competence, and adherence to doctrine producing victory. But behind the advancing armies, a different kind of operation unfolds in the captured territory. Hours after Wehrmacht units secure Polish towns, other forces arrive, the Einsatzgruppen, special task forces of SS and security police, totaling around 3,000 men organised into 5 operational groups. Their mission has nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with Nazi racial ideology. The elimination of Poland's leadership class, the terrorization of the Jewish population, the beginning of what will become the Holocaust. In towns, Blaskowitz's soldiers have just secured SS units round up teachers, priests, professionals, anyone who might organise Polish resistance. Mass shootings begin within days of occupation. Jewish communities face immediate persecution. Synagogues burned, shops looted, men beaten in the streets while SS cameras film for propaganda. September 15th, 1939. The town of Benzin, recently captured by elements of Blaskowitz's army, SS Gruppenführer Udo von Woysch's Einsatzgruppe arrives and conducts a brutal action. Jewish men dragged from homes, forced into the marketplace, beaten and humiliated before being shot or burned alive when SS troops set fire to the synagogue with people locked inside. Wehrmacht soldiers witnessed this atrocity, some in horror, others with indifference, a few with approval. Reports filter up the chain of command to Blaskowitz's headquarters. These are not combat operations. These are not military necessities. These are crimes, violations of the laws of war that German officers theoretically still respect. The question becomes what, if anything, a German general can do about SS actions that occur in territory his army controls, but under authority his army doesn't command. September 22nd, in Dynów, a town in southeastern Poland, SS units execute 50 Jewish men in a public shooting. Wehrmacht officers stationed nearby include the incident in their situation reports with the bureaucratic detachment of men noting weather conditions. The report reaches Blaskowitz's headquarters at 8th Army, now established in Łódź, where staff officers file it alongside hundreds of other documents. The pattern is already clear. Behind the Wehrmacht's military success comes an SS campaign of terror that uses military security as pretext for racial persecution. Polish Jews are being targeted not for any military threat they pose, but simply for existing in territory the Nazis intend to Germanize. The violence serves no tactical purpose. It actually harms military operations by diverting SS manpower, generating civilian hatred, and forcing Wehrmacht units to allocate soldiers to security duties, because SS actions destabilize occupied areas. Blaskowitz confronts local SS commanders about the killings. The conversations follow a pattern that will repeat throughout occupied Poland. Wehrmacht officers objecting on grounds of military discipline and order. SS officers responding that they operate under separate authority, that their mission comes directly from Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, that the Wehrmacht has no jurisdiction over police and security operations. The command structure Hitler created has produced exactly this result. Two parallel German forces in occupied territory, one theoretically bound by military law and the Hague Conventions, the other answering only to Nazi ideology and Himmler's orders. Blaskowitz can order his soldiers, but he cannot order the SS. He can protest to Army High Command, but they cannot order the SS. The only man who can is Hitler, and Hitler authorized the SS mission in the first place. Late September brings administrative changes that formalize this dysfunctional system. Hitler divides occupied Poland into zones. Eastern portions will be absorbed by the Soviet Union under the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Western portions will be annexed directly into Germany. The centre will become the general government, a colonial possession administered by Nazi Party lawyer Hans Frank. Blaskowitz's 8th Army continues to command military forces, but Frank controls civilian administration and the SS operates under its own authority in both spheres. It's a recipe for chaos and atrocity, and it produces both with efficiency. Frank will spend the next years turning the general government into a laboratory for Nazi racial policy, starving Polish cities, ghettoizing Jewish populations, and preparing for deportations and murder on scales still unimaginable in autumn 1939. The psychological impact on Wehrmacht soldiers varies widely, revealing the diversity of moral response within the German military. Some soldiers express disgust at SS actions, writing letters home that complain about atrocities or confiding to comrades their horror at what they're witnessing. Others rationalize the violence as regrettable but necessary, accepting SS claims that Polish Jews represent a security threat or that harsh measures prevent partisan resistance. A disturbing number embrace the violence, their latent anti-Semitism activated by Nazi propaganda and the permission structure of occupation. Many simply focus on their military duties and avoid thinking about what happens in the towns behind the front lines. The Wehrmacht as an institution responds with bureaucratic cowardice. Incidents are reported, filed, and forgotten. climbing the chain of command until they disappear into the black hole of higher headquarters that don't want to acknowledge what everyone knows is happening. For Blaskowitz personally, the Polish campaign represents success and failure in equal measure. Militarily, his 8th Army has performed superbly, validating his years of training and preparation. By campaign's end, his forces have captured over 170,000 Polish prisoners of war, secured a vast swath of territory, and demonstrated that German tactical doctrine and training create overwhelming advantages against conventionally organised opponents. He receives commendation from Army Group South Commander Gerd von Rundstedt and recognition from Army High Command. October 5th brings official victory. Germany and the Soviet Union announced they've defeated Poland and divided its territory between them. For a professional soldier judged by professional military standards, Blaskowitz has triumphed. But the triumph tastes of ashes because the Polish campaign has taught him something that contradicts 38 years of military training. That in Hitler's Germany, military success and moral catastrophe are not opposites, but twins. That his competent execution of military operations has enabled SS atrocities he finds repugnant, that there's no clean separation between soldiering and supporting a regime that murders civilians as policy. The reports keep coming, more incidents, more killings, more evidence that Poland isn't being conquered but destroyed, its intelligentsia eliminated, its Jewish population marked for something even worse than the persecution already underway. Johannes Blaskowitz, 56-year-old Prussian general, veteran of the Great War, apolitical professional soldier, faces a choice his training never prepared him for: accept what's happening as beyond his responsibility, or do something that might cost him everything. On a cool November day in Spauer Palace, his headquarters in occupied Poland, Blaskowitz picks up his pen and begins writing a document that will define his legacy more than any battle he's won. November 6th, 1939. In Spauer Palace, the former hunting lodge of Polish kings now serving as 8th Army headquarters, General Johannes Blaskowitz sits at his desk surrounded by reports that read like criminal indictments. Before him lie incident summaries compiled by subordinate commanders: SS shootings in Turek on October 10th, 22 Jewish men executed without trial, mass arrests in Kalisz on October 15th, over 300 Polish professionals deported to concentration camps, synagogue burnings in Piotrków on November 2nd, Wehrmacht soldiers forced to watch while SS men laugh and take photographs. Each report represents professional officers attempting to document crimes they witnessed but cannot prevent, sending evidence up the chain of command because that's what military protocol demands, hoping someone with actual authority might intervene. Blaskowitz reads these reports with mounting anger, not the hot fury of impulsive action, but the cold rage of a professional watching criminals destroy his army's discipline and Germany's honour. The memorandum he drafts over the following weeks represents something unprecedented in Nazi Germany: a systematic, detailed, official condemnation of SS atrocities written by a serving general and submitted through military channels to the highest levels of command. Blaskowitz doesn't write as a humanitarian or a resistor. He writes as a Prussian officer, arguing that SS actions violate military discipline, damage operational security, and poison relations between Wehrmacht soldiers and the regime they serve. His legal framework is conservative, almost pedantic. He cites violations of military jurisdiction, argues that SS crimes undermine troop morale, worries that indiscipline will spread from SS units to Wehrmacht units. He never questions the conquest of Poland or German strategic objectives. He simply argues, with lawyerly precision, that the methods being employed contradict military law, professional standards, and practical effectiveness. November 27th. Blaskowitz submits the first memorandum to Commander-in-Chief Walther von Brauchitsch. The document runs to multiple pages and includes dozens of specific incidents, dates, locations, SS, unit designations, numbers killed. He documents how SS Gruppenführer Woisch's task force has conducted mass shootings across southern Poland, how Einsatzgruppen have executed Polish intellectuals and priests, how SS troops have burned synagogues and beaten Jewish civilians in organized pogroms. He notes that Wehrmacht soldiers who witness these acts experience internal revulsion and that military discipline suffers when troops see authority figures committing crimes. He argues that allowing the SS to operate above military law in occupied territory creates a hotbed of future resistance because Polish civilians blame all Germans, Wehrmacht and SS alike, for the atrocities. His conclusion is stark. Unless higher authority stops the SS excesses, the Wehrmacht's relationship with the German people and with occupied populations will be irreparably damaged. The memorandum enters the military bureaucracy's digestive system and begins its slow journey through layers of command. It reaches Brauchich's desk in early December. The commander-in-chief, a weak man terrified of Hitler, reads it with horror, not at the crimes described, but at the document's existence. He knows that confronting Hitler about SS actions means confronting the core of Nazi ideology, questioning the racial war that Hitler has openly announced as Germany's purpose in the East. Brauchitsch files the memorandum and hopes it will be forgotten, but Blaskowitz isn't finished. Through December and January, more reports arrive at his headquarters. More shootings, more deportations, more evidence that SS terror is intensifying rather than diminishing. Polish Jews are being forced into ghettos in major cities, sealed behind walls and barbed wire to starve slowly. The Einsatzgruppen have executed thousands, and the number keeps rising. February 2nd, 1940. Blaskowitz writes a second memorandum, longer and more damning than the first. This document abandons cautious bureaucratic language and speaks with the blunt force of moral outrage, barely contained by professional prose. He writes that the attitude of the troops toward the SS and police fluctuates between abhorrence and hatred, that Wehrmacht soldiers are ashamed to witness SS crimes and cannot understand why military commanders tolerate them. He documents 54 specific incidents with supporting evidence, annexes containing reports, witness statements, even photographs of SS atrocities. He argues that SS actions constitute not just criminal behaviour, but threats to military operations, that the terror campaign has united the Polish population in hatred of Germany, that Wehrmacht security operations have become more difficult because civilians won't cooperate with any German forces. His language is still officially professional, but the fury underneath is palpable. This second memorandum reaches not just Brauchitsch, but the entire Army High Command, and through them, Adolf Hitler himself, the Führers. Reaction is immediate and volcanic. According to witnesses, Hitler erupts in rage, shouting that you cannot wage war with Salvation Army methods, that Blaskowitz is a childish weakling who doesn't understand the racial war being fought in the East. Hitler calls Blaskowitz's concerns evidence of outdated thinking, the squeamishness of old Prussian officers who don't grasp that this war requires new methods, harsher measures, the elimination of entire populations deemed racially inferior or politically dangerous. The gap between Hitler's worldview and Blaskowitz's Prussian code is unbridgeable. Hitler sees mass murder as policy, Blaskowitz sees it as crime. Hitler believes ideology justifies any action. Blaskowitz believes honour constrains all actions. They speak different languages, serve different gods, inhabit different moral universes. The memoranda's bureaucratic pathway reveals the Wehrmacht's institutional cowardice. After Blaskowitz's documents reach Berlin, they circulate among senior commanders. General Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Blaskowitz's immediate superior, General Georg von Küchler, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of Military Intelligence, who has been collecting his own evidence of SS crimes. These officers read Blaskowitz's detailed documentation and respond with embarrassed silence. None publicly support his protest, none submit their own memoranda confirming the atrocities, none threaten resignation if the SS continues operating above military law. They file Blaskowitz's documents, acknowledge receipt, and do nothing. Their inaction reveals the Wehrmacht's moral bankruptcy more clearly than any Nazi propaganda. These are not victims of Hitler's dictatorship, but collaborators in it. Men who prefer career advancement to confronting crimes they know are happening. Only a handful of other officers file similar protests, and they too are ignored or suppressed. General Johannes von Blaskowitz stands nearly alone among Germany's 200-plus active generals in formally, systematically, and persistently documenting SS atrocities and demanding they cease. Admiral Canaris of the Abwehr, Military Intelligence, has compiled his own reports and shares Blaskowitz's horror. But Canaris operates in the shadows. feeding information to potential resistors rather than filing official protests. General Karl Heinrich von Stulpnagel and General Kurt von Ulex also complain about SS actions in Poland, but their objections lack Blaskowitz's systematic documentation and legal argumentation. The overwhelming majority of Wehrmacht generals say nothing, see nothing, know nothing, even as reports of atrocities flood military channels. The content of Blaskowitz's February memorandum deserves close examination because it reveals what bothered him and, equally important, what didn't. He never questions German conquest of Poland or the occupation itself. He never mentions Nazi racial ideology as morally wrong. He never argues that Jews, Poles, or other persecuted groups have rights that Germans should respect. His objections are instrumental and institutional. SS crimes harm military discipline, endanger operational security, and violate the professional standards that armies require to function. He writes as a Prussian officer arguing for order, not as a humanitarian arguing for justice. This limited moral framework helps explain both why he protested and why his protest failed. He spoke a language of military professionalism to a regime that rejected professionalism in favour of ideological zealotry. February 5, 1940, Hitler's response to the memoranda is characteristically indirect and cruel. Rather than argue with Blaskowitz or court-martial him for insubordination, Hitler simply sidelines him, removes him from any position where he might actually obstruct SS operations. Blaskowitz will keep his rank and his salary, will even receive future commands, but he will be marked as politically unreliable, as one of those old Prussians who doesn't understand the new Germany. The message to other generals is clear. Moral protest won't get you executed, but it will end your career advancement and ensure you're excluded from important operations. It's a calculated response that neutralizes dissent without creating martyrs. Blaskowitz has written the conscience of the Wehrmacht into an official document, and his reward is bureaucratic exile. The memoranda will be filed away, hidden in archives, forgotten by everyone except the few who still believe that documenting crimes means something even when the criminals run the government. February 1940, Berlin. In the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler reads General Blaskowitz's second memorandum with mounting fury, his face reddening as he flips through pages documenting SS crimes in occupied Poland. Witnesses later recall Hitler shouting that Blaskowitz embodies everything wrong with the old officer: squeamish, sentimental, obsessed with outdated concepts of military honor. According to Martin Bormann's notes, Hitler calls the memorandum childish nonsense, written by someone who doesn't understand that this is a racial war. The Führer's rage isn't defensive. He isn't denying the atrocities Blaskowitz documents. He's angry that a general dares to question them, dares to suggest that Nazi ideology should bow to military regulations, dares to imagine that German soldiers should behave according to laws written before the Nazi Revolution. Hitler makes a decision. Blaskowitz will be professionally destroyed, but quietly, without trial or public drama that might make him a martyr. The punishment unfolds through bureaucratic marginalization rather than dramatic confrontation. May 10th, 1940. Germany launches Fall Gelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. The Wehrmacht throws everything into this campaign. 135 divisions, thousands of tanks and aircraft, the full weight of German military power against the Western Allies. Blaskowitz, commanding general of an experienced army, victor of the Polish campaign, competent professional soldier, receives no command role. He sits in Poland watching the Wehrmacht achieve its greatest triumph without him, as Heinz Guderian's panzers race to the Channel, as the British Expeditionary Force evacuates from Dunkirk, as France collapses in 6 weeks of fighting that stuns the world. Generals younger and less experienced than Blaskowitz become household names. Erwin Rommel, Ewald von Kleist, Hermann Hoth. Their faces appear in newsreels. They receive Knight's Crosses and promotions. Blaskowitz remains in Poland, his career momentum destroyed by 2 memoranda. The contrast with other generals is stark and revealing. Field Marshal Walther von Reichenau, who has enthusiastically supported SS actions and openly embraced Nazi ideology, receives command of the 6th Army and plays a crucial role in the French campaign. Guderian, the panzer theorist whose tanks spearhead the invasion, becomes a national hero. Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, achieves legendary status with his aggressive tactics and personal bravery. These are the officers Hitler rewards. True believers, political generals who see military operations and ideological warfare as inseparable. Blaskowitz, the apolitical professional who dared suggest that there should be limits, watches from the sidelines. The lesson to other generals is unmistakable. Nazi loyalty matters more than military competence, ideology trumps professionalism, and moral qualms are career suicide. June 1940 brings France's surrender and Germany's moment of supreme triumph. Hitler tours conquered Paris, poses for photographs at the Eiffel Tower, dictates armistice terms in the same railway car where Germany surrendered in 1918. The Wehrmacht seems invincible, its blitzkrieg doctrine vindicated, its equipment and training superior to anything the Allies can field. Victory parades in Berlin feature successful commanders receiving decorations from the Führer himself. Blaskowitz attends none of these celebrations, his name appears in no victory communiques. The regime treats him like an embarrassment to be hidden, proof that even in triumph, Nazi Germany cannot tolerate dissent or moral complexity. He's done nothing wrong, according to military regulations. He's filed reports through proper channels, documented crimes, requested that higher authority address problems. But in Hitler's Germany, following proper procedure when it conflicts with ideology is itself a crime. October 1940, Blaskowitz receives transfer to command 1st Army in Alsace, the newly conquered territory between France and Germany. It's a backwater posting garrisoning occupied territory, while the real action unfolds elsewhere. 1st Army's mission is essentially defensive. Hold the French-German border, prevent sabotage, maintain occupation control. For an ambitious general in a victorious army, this is a dead-end assignment. For Hitler, it's perfect. Blaskowitz is far from Poland, where SS operations continue and accelerate, far from the Eastern Front, where even greater atrocities are being planned, sequestered in a quiet sector, where his troublesome conscience can't interfere with Nazi racial policy. He commands troops, maintains his military salary, performs competent service. He has been neutralized without being eliminated, rendered harmless through isolation rather than execution. The years 1940 through 1941 demonstrate the regime's sophisticated approach to managing internal dissent. Hitler could have court-martialed Blaskowitz for insubordination. The February memorandum certainly questioned policies the Führer had personally authorized. Execution would have been legally dubious, but practically possible in a totalitarian state, where Hitler's word is law. But murdering a respected general for documenting SS crimes would acknowledge that those crimes occurred, would create a martyr, might encourage other officers to think of Blaskowitz as a hero rather than a troublemaker. Far better to simply sideline him, let him rot in backwater commands, demonstrate that moral protest leads to professional oblivion. It's a calculated cruelty that manages dissent without creating resistance, that allows Hitler to tell himself and others that German generals serve willingly, that no one significant objects to his policies. The institutional Wehrmacht response reveals moral cowardice masquerading as political realism. After Blaskowitz's memoranda circulate among senior commanders, the Army High Command issues no formal backing, no statement supporting his concerns, no demand that SS operations come under Wehrmacht authority. Individual generals who privately agree with Blaskowitz remain publicly silent. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded Army Group South during the Polish campaign and received Blaskowitz's reports firsthand, says nothing. General Franz Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff, records his discomfort in his personal diary but takes no official action. They rationalize their silence with various excuses. The SS operates under separate authority. Military commanders can't control political policies. The Führer has made his decision. These rationalizations ignore the obvious truth. Wehrmacht cooperation is essential for SS operations. Military commanders could obstruct SS atrocities if they chose to, and silent acquiescence enables crimes as surely as active participation. Statistical analysis reveals how exceptional Blaskowitz's protest actually was. At the start of World War II, the Wehrmacht has approximately 200 active generals commanding divisions, corps, armies, and army groups. Over the course of the war, total Wehrmacht generals, including all promotions, will exceed 2,000 officers. Of these, fewer than 20 file formal protests about SS atrocities. And most of those protests are far less detailed and persistent than Blaskowitz's memoranda. The overwhelming majority of Wehrmacht generals either actively cooperate with SS operations, remain carefully silent about crimes they witness, or focus entirely on military operations while ignoring the murder happening in territories they control. Blaskowitz's protests make him a statistical outlier, exceptional not because his moral standards are particularly high, but because the institution's standards are catastrophically low. The price of protest extends beyond career stagnation. Blaskowitz's reputation among fellow officers becomes complicated and controversial. Nazi sympathizers dismiss him as weak and old-fashioned, infected with obsolete notions about military honor. Political generals like Reich mock him privately, suggesting that real soldiers understand harsh measures are necessary in racial war. Even apolitical professionals view him with ambivalence. Some admire his courage, others think him foolish for pointlessly damaging his career. Many simply avoid discussing the memoranda altogether. The officer corps fragments into factions: true believers who embrace Nazi ideology, careerists who mouth ideological platitudes while focusing on advancement, old Prussians who quietly maintain professional standards, and a tiny minority willing to openly question regime policies. Blaskowitz belongs to this last category, and it costs him the camaraderie and professional respect he's earned over 38 years of service. By late 1941, as Germany prepares for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Blaskowitz remains exiled in France, while younger, more ideologically reliable generals receive key commands. The Eastern Front will see Wehrmacht involvement in atrocities that dwarf anything witnessed in Poland. Mass shootings of Jews, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Wehrmacht units providing logistical support and manpower to SS killing operations. Military commanders issuing orders that explicitly authorize racial murder. Blaskowitz is spared witnessing and potentially protesting these greater crimes because Hitler has already isolated him. The memoranda have marked him permanently as unreliable, as someone whose Prussian conscience might interfere with the systematic genocide the Nazis planned for conquered Soviet territories. He sits in France, commands garrison troops, and waits for a war that has already passed him by. The price of protest, it turns out, is not execution but irrelevance, not martyrdom but being slowly forgotten while greater crimes unfold elsewhere. September 1939, Northern Poland. While Johannes Blaskowitz documents SS atrocities in the south, General Georg von Küchler commands Army Group North, conquering Poland's Baltic territories with the same efficiency Blaskowitz demonstrates in his sector. Küchler faces identical situations: Einsatzgruppen following his advancing troops, mass shootings of Polish civilians, synagogue burnings, the whole apparatus of Nazi terror unfolding in territory his army controls. But Küchler makes a different choice. He issues orders directing his subordinates to cooperate with SS operations, to provide logistical support and security for Einsatzgruppen activities, to treat SS racial measures as legitimate security operations. When officers complain about SS behaviour, Küchler tells them to focus on military duties and leave police matters to police authorities. He files no memoranda, makes no protests, raises no objections. For his cooperation and ideological reliability, Küchler receives promotion to Field Marshal and continues commanding major operations throughout the war. The contrast between Blaskowitz's protest and Küchler's compliance reveals the spectrum of Wehrmacht responses to Nazi atrocities, and that spectrum skews heavily toward collaboration. Most German generals fall somewhere between Blaskowitz's formal opposition and Küchler's active support, occupying a comfortable middle ground of willful ignorance. They don't order their troops to participate in SS killings, but they don't prevent such participation when individual soldiers volunteer. They don't explicitly authorize cooperation with Einsatzgruppen, but they don't obstruct it when SS commanders request Wehrmacht assistance. They read reports of atrocities with carefully cultivated detachment, filing them away as unfortunate excesses beyond military jurisdiction. This studied indifference allows them to maintain the fiction that they're professional soldiers engaged in conventional warfare while crimes against humanity occur in territories they control. October 10th, 1941, Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, commanding 6th Army in Ukraine, issues what becomes known as the Severity Order, a document that tears away any remaining pretense of Wehrmacht innocence. Reich writes that the soldier must have full understanding for the necessity of the harsh but just atonement of Jewish subhumanity. He explicitly orders his troops to support SS operations against civilians, states that conventional military law doesn't apply in racial war, instructs his subordinates that destroying the Jewish Bolshevik system is as important as defeating the Red Army. This isn't a private conversation or a verbal wink and nod. It's an official military order distributed through command channels, translated into doctrine, made binding on hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Reichenau receives no censure for this order. Instead, Hitler praises it and encourages other commanders to issue similar instructions. November 19th, 1941. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding 11th Army in Crimea, issues his own version of Reichenau's order, stating that the Jewish Bolshevik system must be exterminated and that soldiers must bring understanding for the harsh atonement of Jewry. Manstein, considered one of the Wehrmacht's most brilliant operational commanders, known for defensive genius and tactical creativity, sees no contradiction between professional military excellence and explicitly ordering his army to support genocide. Through late 1941 and early 1942, Manstein's 11th Army operates in the same territory where Einsatzgruppe D murders tens of thousands of Crimean Jews. Wehrmacht units under Manstein's command don't just ignore these killings. They provide security cordons, logistical support, sometimes even troops to supplement SS execution squads. In December 1941 alone, approximately 11,000 Jews are murdered in Simferopol, Crimea's capital, and Wehrmacht soldiers, under Manstein's command, participate in or facilitate many of these killings. The litany of general officers who collaborate with or ignore SS atrocities reads like a roster of Wehrmacht leadership. General Erich Hübner, commanding 4th Panzer Group during the invasion of the Soviet Union, issues pre-invasion orders describing the coming war as a struggle of racial extermination. General Hermann Hoth, commanding another Panzer Army, tells his troops they're fighting Jewish Bolshevism and must be prepared for harsh measures against the bearers of this system. General Max von Schenkendorf, responsible for rear area security in Army Group Center's zone, works closely with SS commanders to coordinate anti-partisan operations that are actually cover for murdering Jewish civilians. General Erich von Dem-Bach-Zelewski personally commands mixed Wehrmacht SS units, conducting anti-partisan sweeps that kill tens of thousands of civilians, mostly Jews, in Belarus and Ukraine. These aren't obscure colonels or rogue battalion commanders. They're army and corps commanders, men controlling hundreds of thousands of troops, setting policy for vast occupied territories. June 6, 1941, 1 week before Operation Barbarossa begins, the Wehrmacht High Command issues the Kommissar Order, directive that Soviet political officers captured by German forces are to be immediately executed without trial. This order violates every principle of military law the Wehrmacht theoretically upholds, contravenes the Geneva Convention protections for prisoners of war, explicitly authorizes murder of unarmed captives. It's issued not by the SS, but by OKW, signed by Wilhelm Keitel, distributed through military channels to every army, corps, and division preparing for the Eastern Offensive. The Kommissar Order forces every Wehrmacht unit to become executioners, turning professional soldiers into participants in ideological killing. Some commanders, notably Colonel Henning von Tresckow and General Johannes Fressner, quietly refuse to implement the order. Most enforce it fully. The Wehrmacht will execute thousands of Soviet commissars and political officers under this directive, and not a single German general resigns in protest or demands its rescission. The scale of Wehrmacht involvement in atrocities on the Eastern Front dwarfs anything that occurred in Poland. Einsatzgruppen, operating behind Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South, murder over 500,000 Jews, Roma, and Soviet officials between June 1941 and spring 1942. And this industrial-scale killing requires Wehrmacht cooperation at every level. Advance notice of military operations so SS units can follow. Logistical support including transportation, fuel and ammunition, security cordons around execution sites, detaching Wehrmacht troops to supplement SS killing squads when manpower runs short, rounding up victims and delivering them to SS execution sites. Military commanders know these operations are happening because they receive after-action reports, because supply officers note SS ammunition requests, because soldiers write letters home describing mass shootings they witnessed or participated in. Statistical documentation reveals the scope of this collaboration. Studies of Wehrmacht activities in occupied Soviet territories identify at least 100 Wehrmacht divisions whose personnel participated in or directly supported anti-Jewish operations, whether through massacres, ghetto establishment, or logistical support for SS killing operations. Research into military documents finds thousands of Wehrmacht reports mentioning executions, reprisals, and cleansing operations that are euphemisms for murdering civilians. The ratio of combat deaths to civilian deaths in territories occupied by army groups, north, centre, and south, reveals deliberate killing far beyond military necessity. For every Soviet soldier killed in combat, approximately 2 Soviet civilians are murdered through Wehrmacht or SS actions. Professional armies fighting conventional wars don't generate those ratios. Genocidal campaigns operating under military protection do. The post-war myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the claim that German armed forces fought honourably while only the SS committed atrocities, collapses under documentary evidence from German military archives. After 1945, surviving Wehrmacht generals testify at Nuremberg and subsequent trials that they knew nothing about Holocaust operations, that SS units operated independently, that military commanders had no knowledge of or involvement in civilian murders. These testimonies are provably false. German military records captured by Allied forces include thousands of documents proving Wehrmacht commanders knew about, reported on, and often facilitated SS killing operations. The generals lie not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because admitting the truth means acknowledging that the Wehrmacht as an institution enabled genocide, that professional soldiers collaborated with mass murder, that honour and duty became accomplice to the worst crimes of the 20th century. Against this overwhelming pattern of collaboration and complicity, Johannes Blaskowitz's protests appear even more exceptional and more futile. He objected early, when the killing was still relatively small scale, when intervention might theoretically have mattered. He used official channels, military protocol, the language of professional standards. He documented systematically, compiled evidence, built legal cases, and he achieved nothing. The generals who remained silent advanced their careers. The generals who actively collaborated became field marshals. The general who protested got exiled to backwater commands. The Wehrmacht's institutional choice was clear. Better to be Reich ordering troops to support Jewish extermination than Blaskowitz filing memoranda requesting that extermination cease. Better to be Manstein providing logistical support for mass murder than Blaskowitz documenting that murder's impact on military discipline. Better to be any of the dozens of generals who said nothing, saw nothing, knew nothing, than the one general who wrote everything down and demanded someone in authority care. The question that haunts this chapter isn't why Blaskowitz protested, it's why so few others did. These were professional soldiers, many educated in military academies that taught laws of war and officers' honour. They weren't all Nazis. Many came from conservative military families with traditions predating the Nazi movement. They knew right from wrong. Their own post-war testimonies show they understood, they'd witnessed and enabled crimes. Yet faced with systematic atrocity, they chose careers over conscience, professional advancement over moral action, the comfort of claiming they were just following orders over the risk of following Blaskowitz's example. Their silence enabled the Holocaust as surely as SS bullets and gas chambers. Their willingness to continue professional military service while genocide unfolded in territories they controlled makes them complicit in ways no post-war denials can erase. Johannes Blaskowitz wrote the memoranda they should have all written, and his solitary voice echoes across decades, a testament to the moral failure of an entire military institution. December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft carriers launched their strike on Pearl Harbor, and the Pacific War explodes into existence with the same sudden violence that characterized Germany's conquests in Europe. 4 days later, Adolf Hitler makes what historians will judge as one of his greatest strategic blunders. He declares war on the United States, transforming a European conflict into a genuine world war. In the Reich Chancellery, Nazi leadership celebrates this decision with champagne and speeches about final victory, but the military implications are catastrophic. Germany now faces enemies on all fronts: the Soviet Union in the east, Britain in the west, and the United States, with its vast industrial capacity, preparing to enter both theatres. The Wehrmacht, stretched across thousands of kilometres of occupied territory from Norway to North Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow, must somehow defend an empire it can barely garrison. By February 1942, the strategic situation has transformed from conquest to occupation, from offence to defence. The German military controls more territory than any European power since Napoleon. But controlling territory requires soldiers to guard supply lines, to garrison cities, to suppress resistance movements, to defend thousands of kilometres of coastline against potential invasion. Wehrmacht strength reaches its peak at approximately 9.5 million men, but 3 million of those soldiers are tied down in occupation duties, guarding conquered populations and protecting rear areas. They're not fighting the Red Army at Stalingrad or preparing for Allied invasion in France. They're standing checkpoint duty in Norway, hunting partisans in Yugoslavia, maintaining order in Poland. The empire that looked so impressive on maps in 1940 has become a military liability, draining manpower from combat operations. May 1942 brings Johannes Blaskowitz's return from professional exile. Hitler, facing manpower shortages and the need to defend France's Atlantic coast against possible invasion, needs experienced commanders for garrison duty. Blaskowitz receives appointment as commander of First Army, responsible for southwestern France from the Loire River to the Spanish border. It's not a prestigious posting. Defending peaceful French coast lacks the glory of Eastern Front combat or the excitement of North African desert warfare. But it's a return to active operations, proof that Hitler's grudge has limits when military necessity demands competent officers. Blaskowitz establishes headquarters in Bordeaux and begins the unglamorous work of inspecting defences, organising training, and preparing for an Allied invasion everyone knows is coming eventually. The sector Blaskowitz commands stretches for approximately 350 kilometres of Atlantic coastline, from the Loire estuary south to the Pyrenees. His First Army comprises roughly 130,000 troops, but troops is generous terminology for what he actually commands. Germany's best divisions are dying in Russia or garrisoning Norway against the perpetually feared but never materialised British invasion. France gets what's left: overage soldiers, too old for Eastern Front service; stomach battalions, composed of men with ulcers and digestive problems; convalescent units recovering from wounds; and Ostbataillone, formations of Soviet prisoners of war who volunteered for German service to escape prison camps. These are not the elite forces that conquered Poland and France. These are garrison troops, suitable for occupation duty, but questionable in actual combat against well-equipped Allied forces. August 1942. Blaskowitz tours the Atlantic Wall, the coastal fortification system that Nazi propaganda describes as an impenetrable barrier of concrete and steel. What he finds is considerably less impressive than the newsreels suggest. Hitler's Directive No. 40, issued in March 1942, orders construction of permanent fortifications along Europe's entire Atlantic coastline, from Norway to Spain, 15,000 strongpoints protected by 500,000 obstacles. The propaganda shows massive concrete bunkers bristling with artillery, dragon's teeth, tank barriers, elaborate minefields, every beach transformed into a fortress. Reality is less inspiring in Blaskowitz's sector. Less than 30% of planned fortifications are actually complete. The bunkers that exist are often poorly sited, the obstacles are inadequate, and the defending troops lack the mobility to respond to breakthroughs. The Atlantic Wall is more propaganda than substance, a Potemkin defence that looks formidable in photographs but won't stop determined attackers with naval and air superiority. The resistance situation adds another layer of complexity to occupation duty. The French resistance, that network of communist partisans, Gaullist patriots, and ordinary citizens who've decided they'd rather fight than collaborate, conducts approximately 3,000 sabotage operations in Blaskowitz's sector between 1942 and 1943. They derail trains, cut telephone lines, assassinate collaborators, gather intelligence for London. Most operations are small-scale, pinprick attacks that individually mean little but cumulatively force the Germans to divert thousands of soldiers to guard duty. Every railroad bridge needs sentries. Every telephone exchange needs protection. Every collaborating official needs bodyguards. The Wehrmacht responds with collective punishments, hostage shootings, village destructions, mass arrests that push previously neutral French civilians toward resistance. It's the Poland pattern, repeating on a smaller scale. Occupation breeds resistance. Resistance provokes reprisals. Reprisals generate more resistance. November 8th, 1942. Anglo-American forces land in French North Africa, Morocco, and Algeria, opening a new front against Germany and Italy. Hitler's response is immediate and characteristically excessive. He orders German forces to occupy Vichy France, the supposedly independent zone that's maintained nominal sovereignty under Marshal Pétain's collaborationist government. Blaskowitz's First Army receives orders to move east to cross from occupied France into Vichy territory and secure the Mediterranean coast. It's a purely political operation, requiring no combat. Vichy forces offer no resistance to the Wehrmacht. Occupation. Within days, German troops control Toulon and Marseille, southern France's major ports, and the pretense of French sovereignty ends. The occupation of Vichy France is militarily insignificant, but symbolically important. It reveals how hollow German strength has become, that the Wehrmacht must garrison even its allies' territory, that no conquest is secure enough to leave unguarded. The strategic absurdity of Germany's situation becomes clear when examining troop dispositions in late 1942. On the Eastern Front, the Sixth Army is being encircled at Stalingrad, starving and freezing while Hitler refuses to authorize retreat. Army Group North is locked in the grinding siege of Leningrad, expending enormous resources to capture a city Stalin has ordered held at all costs. Army Group Center and Army Group South are stretched across hundreds of kilometers of steppe, fighting partisan bands in their rear while Soviet armies mass for winter offensives. These fronts are where the war will be won or lost, where German survival depends on every available soldier. Yet, hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht troops garrison France, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, the Balkans, protecting conquests that contribute nothing to defeating the Soviet Union or defending against Allied invasion. Blaskowitz's 130,000 soldiers in southwestern France could potentially make the difference in Russia. But they're stuck guarding beaches against an invasion that won't come for another 18 months. The comparison between Blaskowitz's situation and the Eastern Front reality is stark and depressing. His soldiers in France enjoy relative safety, adequate food, and French wine. They face no combat operations, no massed Soviet offensives, no T-34 tanks or Katyusha rockets. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front consumes German manpower with horrifying efficiency. The Wehrmacht loses over 100,000 men monthly during 1942, killed, wounded, or missing in the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. The soldiers freezing in Russia's winter or dying in Stalingrad's rubble would gladly trade places with Blaskowitz's garrison troops enjoying southwestern France's mild climate. But strategic logic has been overwhelmed by Hitler's imperial overreach. Germany conquered too much territory too quickly, and now the Wehrmacht must garrison an empire it cannot hold while fighting enemies it cannot defeat. Through 1943, Blaskowitz's mission remains unchanged. Prepare for the Allied invasion, maintain order in occupied France, wait for the storm everyone knows is coming. He drills his troops as thoroughly as their quality permits, improves coastal defences within the limits of available resources, and watches the war's momentum shift inexorably against Germany. At Stalingrad, the Sixth Army surrenders in February, 90,000 starving survivors marching into Soviet captivity. In North Africa, German and Italian forces collapse in May. Another 250,000 prisoners lost. Sicily falls in August. Italy itself invaded in September. The Atlantic Wall, that looked so formidable in 1942, increasingly resembles a trap. German forces locked in France, waiting to defend against enemies who can choose when and where to attack, with no strategic reserve and no realistic hope of victory. Blaskowitz has returned from exile to command garrison forces in a defensive war. Germany is slowly losing a competent general given an impossible mission. Hold French territory against Allied armies that will soon possess overwhelming material superiority and complete air dominance. His Prussian training prepared him to win battles through discipline and tactical excellence. It did not prepare him for the strategic bankruptcy of defending an indefensible empire. January 1944, Northern France. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrives to take command of Army Group B, the force responsible for defending France's northern coast from the anticipated Allied invasion. At 52, Rommel is everything. Johannes Blaskowitz is not. A Nazi Party sympathizer since the 1930s, Hitler's favourite general after his desert victories, a media personality whose Afrika Korps exploits have made him legendary across Germany. He's younger than 60-year-old Blaskowitz by 9 years, energetic where Blaskowitz is methodical, a true believer where Blaskowitz remains coldly professional. Hitler has sent Rommel to France with unlimited authority to prepare defences, and everyone understands that Rommel, not Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who officially commands West, will actually control German response to invasion. Blaskowitz's Army Group G in southern France now answers to this famous general whose career trajectory is everything Blaskowitz's could have been if he'd kept his mouth shut about SS atrocities. February 1944 brings their first meeting at Bordeaux, where Rommel inspects Blaskowitz's sector during his whirlwind tour of Atlantic Wall defences. The encounter between these two generals embodies Wehrmacht's fundamental contradictions. Rommel, the celebrity commander who's had Hitler's ear for years, meeting Blaskowitz, the competent professional exiled for moral objections the regime found inconvenient. There's no evidence Rommel knows about Blaskowitz's 1939 memoranda. The Nazi bureaucracy has buried those documents deep in classified files, and discussing them would be dangerous for anyone involved. The two generals talk tactics and logistics, defensive strategies and troop quality, maintaining the fiction that they're professional soldiers focused entirely on military problems. But the unspoken reality hangs between them. Rommel commands because he's politically reliable. Blaskowitz has been sidelined to southern France because he's politically suspect. The strategic debate developing between Rommel and other commanders reveals deep disagreements about how to defend France against invasion. Rommel argues for forward defence, concentrate forces near the coast, stop the Allies on the beaches, destroy the invasion before it establishes a lodgment. His experience in North Africa, where Allied air superiority made mobile operations nearly impossible, convinces him that German forces must win in the first hours, or not at all. General Gehr von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzer Reserves, argues for mobile defence. Keep armoured divisions inland, let Allies land, then destroy them with concentrated counterattack. Field Marshal von Rundstedt inclines towards Schweppenberg's approach, believing forward defence wastes valuable panzer divisions in static coastal defence. Blaskowitz, commanding in southern France, gets squeezed between competing doctrines, expected to defend hundreds of kilometres of coastline, while the High Command argues about basic strategy. March and April 1944 witness furious activity as Rommel drives construction of beach obstacles and mine-laying with the energy that characterised his desert campaigns. He demands millions of mines, hundreds of thousands of obstacles, every beach turned into a killing ground. He personally inspects defences, verbally destroys officers whose sectors don't meet his standards, pushes construction schedules far beyond what available resources support. Blaskowitz, conducting similar inspections in his sector, notes the same resource shortages Rommel faces. Not enough concrete, not enough steel, not enough mines, not enough of anything except propaganda about the impregnable Atlantic Wall. The reality both generals confront is that Germany in 1944 cannot adequately defend 1,000 kilometres of coastline, cannot concentrate sufficient forces everywhere, cannot match Allied material superiority. They can improve defences, train troops, prepare counterattack plans. They cannot actually prevent Allied invasion from succeeding. The force ratios tell the story that rhetoric obscures. By May 1944, Rommel's Army Group B, defending northern France and Belgium, has 38 divisions, approximately 1 million men. Blaskowitz's Army Group G in southern France has 19 divisions, roughly 400,000 troops, of which perhaps half are combat effective. The Allies preparing for D-Day have assembled 156 divisions in Britain, equipped with thousands of tanks, supported by overwhelming air superiority and complete naval dominance. The Germans know invasion's coming, they don't know where or when, and they lack sufficient forces to defend everywhere adequately. Rommel focuses on Normandy and Pas-de-Calais, the most likely landing sites. Blaskowitz guards southern France, where a secondary invasion seems possible but not immediately probable. Both generals command forces that are outnumbered, outgunned, and will fight without air cover against enemies, who can call down aerial destruction with terrifying precision. The command structure complicates everything. Rundstedt officially commands Obi West, Western Command, encompassing all German forces in France. Under him, Rommel commands Army Group B in the north, Blaskowitz commands Army Group G in the south. But Panzer reserves don't answer to Rommel or Blaskowitz. They're under OKW control, requiring Hitler's personal approval to move. The 7th Army in Normandy, the 15th Army in Pas-de-Calais, the 1st Army in Brittany, all have different commanders with overlapping responsibilities. It's the standard Nazi system. Overlapping authorities, competing chains of command, Hitler maintaining control by preventing any subordinate from accumulating too much power. In a rapidly evolving tactical situation requiring quick decisions, this command chaos will prove catastrophic. But in May 1944, it's the system Rommel and Blaskowitz must navigate. The personal contrast between the two generals reveals itself in their relationships with Hitler and the Nazi regime. Rommel has met the Führer dozens of times, has been photographed with him, has received personal telephone calls and handwritten notes of encouragement. Hitler trusts Rommel enough to send him to France with extraordinary authority. Blaskowitz has met Hitler exactly 0 times in 1944, receives no personal communications, operates under the permanent shadow of his 1939 protests. Rommel's loyalty is assumed, Blaskowitz's loyalty is suspect. Yet both generals prepare for the same invasion. Both understand Germany's deteriorating strategic position. Both harbour private doubts they cannot express. Rommel has been slowly turning against Hitler, his North African experience, teaching him that the Führer's strategic grasp is delusional. But he maintains the pretense of loyalty because openly defying Hitler means relief and possibly death. Blaskowitz maintains the same pretense for different reasons. He never believed in Hitler, but he swore an oath, and professional soldiers honour their oaths, even when serving regimes they despise. May 1944 brings final preparations. Rommel issues demands that cannot be met. More mines, more obstacles, more troops. Blaskowitz watches his northern colleagues' frenetic energy and continues his methodical improvement of southern France's defences, knowing that neither approach will matter when Allied material superiority finally overwhelms German defences. The Allies will land with air support the Germans cannot match, naval gunfire the Germans cannot answer, logistical support the Germans cannot interdict. The Wehrmacht will fight hard. German soldiers are still among the world's best trained and most professional. But they'll fight at hopeless odds, without air cover, without adequate reserves, commanded by a system where Hitler personally controls operational decisions he's not competent to make. June approaches, bringing with it the certain knowledge that everything is about to change. Allied air attacks on French transportation networks intensify, cutting rail lines and destroying bridges, isolating German forces in their coastal defences. The weather turns uncertain, the English Channel churning with storms that might delay invasion or might provide cover for landing operations. Rommel inspects Normandy's defences one more time, travels to Germany for his wife's birthday, believing the weather makes invasion unlikely in early June. Blaskowitz remains at his headquarters in southern France, far from where the invasion will fall, commanding forces that will become irrelevant in hours when Allied armies strike 500 kilometres north. 2 generals, 2 approaches, 2 personalities, both about to experience the catastrophe they've spent months preparing to prevent. The Atlantic Wall, that propagandistic fortress, is about to be tested by the largest amphibious invasion in human history. And neither Rommel's energy nor Blaskowitz's competence will change the fact that Germany has already lost this battle, has probably already lost this war, is fighting now only to postpone the inevitable defeat. August 15th, 1944, 8 o'clock in the morning, the Mediterranean coast of southern France erupts with naval gunfire as 1,370 Allied warships open bombardment of Provence beaches. Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France, has begun with overwhelming force, 151,000 American, French and British troops preparing to storm ashore, supported by 1,000 aircraft and 3 aircraft carrier groups. Johannes Blaskowitz's Army Group G, defending this entire coast from the Italian border to the Rhone River, numbers approximately 100,000 troops scattered across hundreds of kilometers. The force ratio is approximately 5-1 against the Germans before the first landing craft touches sand. Blaskowitz, at his headquarters in Avignon, receives initial reports and understands immediately what any competent professional soldier would recognize. His defense is doomed. The only question is whether he can conduct an organized retreat or whether Army Group G will be destroyed where it stands. The invasion proceeds with the mechanical efficiency of overwhelming material superiority. American Sixth Corps assaults beaches near Saint-Tropez and Saint-Raphael, encountering surprisingly light resistance because Blaskowitz has insufficient troops to defend every landing site. French forces, fighting now to liberate their own country after years of exile and defeat, storm ashore with particular ferocity. British commandos seize key positions. Airborne troops, dropped inland during the night, secure exits from the beaches. By mid-afternoon, August 15th, over 60,000 Allied troops are ashore and pushing inland against German defences that simply lack the strength to contain them. The German garrison divisions, composed largely of overage soldiers and foreign volunteers, collapse under coordinated naval gunfire, air attack, and massed infantry assault. Many defenders surrender quickly. Others fight briefly, then retreat. A few hold strong points with the stubbornness of professional soldiers, even when positions are hopeless. August 17th brings Blaskowitz's headquarters grim news. Allied forces have achieved breakthrough at all landing points. American armour is racing inland, French forces are driving toward Toulon and Marseille, and German coastal defences have been overwhelmed. Blaskowitz faces a commander's nightmare. Multiple penetrations, Allied air superiority preventing daylight movement, no strategic reserves to plug gaps or mount counterattacks. He can order his scattered divisions to hold in place, which will result in their encirclement and destruction, or he can order retreat, abandoning southern France, but potentially saving his army to fight elsewhere. The choice seems obvious from a military perspective: retreat, maintain Army Group G as a fighting force, delay Allied advance up the Rhone Valley. But Hitler's philosophy of defence is different. Never retreat, hold every metre of ground, turn every city into a fortress that must be taken at maximum cost to the enemy. August 19th, 1944, Hitler's order arrives at Blaskowitz's headquarters. Marseille and Toulon are to be held as fortresses, defended to the last man, no surrender authorised regardless of circumstances. Blaskowitz reads this order with the sick certainty of a professional soldier being commanded to sacrifice troops for no military gain. Marseille and Toulon are doomed. Allied forces will capture them within days, regardless of how many German soldiers die defending ruins. Holding these cities serves no strategic purpose, except perhaps delaying Allied advance by a few days, but Hitler's order is explicit, and disobeying direct orders from the Führer means court-martial and execution. Blaskowitz forwards the fortress directive to the garrison commanders, General Major Hans Schaefer in Toulon with roughly 15,000 troops, General Lieutenant Hans von der Heide in Marseille with approximately 12,000. Both commanders receive the same impossible order: hold your fortress, fight to the last, accept no surrender. The French forces, attacking their own cities now occupied by Germans, show no mercy. Marseille's garrison, blockaded by sea and surrounded by land, fights street by street through the port city while French artillery reduces buildings to rubble. Toulon's defences, better prepared and more determined, hold longer against French and American assault. But the outcome is never in doubt. Allied naval gunfire destroys fortified positions, Allied airstrikes crater German strongpoints, and French infantry, motivated by liberation of their homeland, press attacks that professional soldiers admire for courage, even as they kill professionally. August 28th, Marseille falls, its garrison surrendering after days of pointless resistance. Toulon holds slightly longer, its defenders fighting until ammunition runs out and further resistance becomes physically impossible. By August 28th, both fortresses have surrendered. Approximately 17,000 German soldiers marching into Allied captivity, their sacrifice buying perhaps 3 days of Allied delay. While the fortresses die, Blaskowitz executes the mission. Hitler didn't explicitly authorize, but which military competence demands, retreating Army Group G northward toward Germany. The withdrawal up the Rhone Valley becomes a textbook demonstration of professional military skill applied to hopeless strategic circumstances. Blaskowitz establishes rearguard positions at river crossings and defiles forces that delay Allied pursuit while the main body retreats northward. He maintains unit cohesion, despite constant Allied air attack and the chaos of fighting withdrawal. He establishes supply points for retreating units, organizes straggler collection, maintains communication between scattered formations. It's everything a competent general should do when conducting retreat under pressure, and Blaskowitz does it as well as available resources permit. The retreat covers approximately 600 kilometers in 4 weeks, from the Mediterranean coast to the approaches to Lyon and beyond. Allied forces pursue aggressively but carefully. They've learned from earlier campaigns that German armies fight most dangerously when cornered, that rearguard actions can inflict surprising casualties. American armor presses the pursuit, French forces liberate city after city, but Blaskowitz maintains fighting cohesion despite overwhelming Allied advantages. By late September, when Army Group G links up with German forces retreating from northern France, Blaskowitz has successfully evacuated approximately 250,000 soldiers from southern France, suffered around 57,000 casualties, and lost massive amounts of equipment abandoned during retreat. From a tactical perspective, it's a successful operation. He's saved the bulk of his army from encirclement and destruction. From a strategic perspective, it's meaningless. Germany has lost southern France, the Mediterranean coast, major ports, and can't replace the casualties or equipment lost. The contrast between tactical success and strategic futility defines Blaskowitz's entire campaign in southern France. As a military technician, he's performed brilliantly, conducted fighting withdrawal against superior forces, maintained unit cohesion, saved most of his army to fight elsewhere. But as defender of southern France, he's failed completely, because failure was inevitable from the moment 1,300 Allied warships appeared off Provence. No amount of professional competence could compensate for 5-to-1 force ratios, complete enemy air superiority, and Allied logistical advantages. The Wehrmacht in 1944 can still fight skillfully at tactical level. What it cannot do is overcome strategic bankruptcy, Hitler's refusal to accept reality, and the cumulative effects of fighting enemies who possess overwhelming material superiority. By early September 1944, the broader military situation has deteriorated into disaster. In the north, Allied armies have liberated Paris, raced across France, and reached the German border. Army Group B, which Rommel commanded until his wounding in July, has lost 500,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. The Eastern Front has collapsed catastrophically. Army Group Centre destroyed in Operation Bagration, Army Group North cut off in the Baltic states, Army Group South retreating across Poland. Germany is losing everywhere simultaneously, defending on all fronts, unable to concentrate forces anywhere, because Hitler demands every position be held, regardless of strategic value. Blaskowitz's successful retreat from southern France is a tactical footnote in a strategic catastrophe, professional competence that matters less each day as Germany's military position becomes unsalvageable. The human cost of the southern France campaign, measured in soldiers dead and cities destroyed, reveals the campaign's essential pointlessness. Allied casualties are relatively light, approximately 15,000 killed and wounded across all forces, a testament to overwhelming material superiority and German inability to conduct sustained defense. German casualties approach 60,000, with many elite units destroyed in the fighting or during retreat. French civilian casualties, particularly in Marseille and Toulon, number in the thousands as urban warfare reduces neighbourhoods to ruins. The French infrastructure, roads and bridges and rail lines, suffers extensive damage. All this death and destruction accomplishes almost nothing of military value. Southern France falls in weeks The Allies secure the ports they wanted, and German forces retreat to defensive positions in Alsace, where they'll fight until the war's end. Blaskowitz has commanded competently, but competence in service of lost causes merely extends suffering without changing outcomes. July 20th, 1944, 12:42 in the afternoon. In Hitler's East Prussian headquarters known as the Wolf's Lair, a bomb explodes during a military conference, tearing through the wooden building and killing 4 officers. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who planted the bomb hidden in a briefcase, has already departed the compound, believing he's killed the Führer and launched a military coup that will end Nazi rule, save Germany from total destruction, and allow negotiated peace with the Western Allies. But Hitler survives, protected by the heavy oak conference table that absorbs much of the blast, emerging from the debris with burst eardrums and shredded uniform, but very much alive. Within hours, the conspiracy begins to unravel. By midnight, the coup has failed completely. By dawn, July 21st, Stauffenberg and 3 co-conspirators have been shot in Berlin. The purge that follows will kill approximately 5,000 Germans accused of connection to the plot, imprison 7,000 more, and confirm Hitler's paranoid suspicion that the army cannot be trusted. Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding Army Group G in southern France, is far from these events, both geographically and organisationally. He receives news of the assassination attempt through military channels, learns of its failure, reads Hitler's fulminations about treacherous generals, and cleansing the Wehrmacht of defeatists. His reaction goes unrecorded in any surviving document, leaving historians to speculate. Did he approve of killing Hitler? Did he wish Stauffenberg had succeeded? Did he consider the coup attempt reckless and dishonourable? The silence is complete and probably deliberate. In July 1944, when Hitler's vengeance is sweeping through the military establishment, smart officers keep their thoughts private and their loyalty displays public. Blaskowitz continues commanding his army group, preparing for the Allied invasion he knows is coming, and makes no statement about the coup attempt that anyone recorded. The conspiracy network that produced the July 20th plot was extensive, involving perhaps 200 core participants and a periphery of thousands who knew something was planned without knowing details. The military conspirators included generals and field marshals frustrated by Hitler's strategic incompetence, conservatives who believed Nazism had dishonoured Germany, and practical men who recognised Germany was losing and wanted to stop the war before total destruction. General Ludwig Beck, former Army Chief of Staff who resigned in 1938, led the civilian military network. Colonel Henning von Tresckow, operations officer for Army Group Center, recruited younger officers. General Friedrich Olbricht, head of the Reserve Army, controlled troops that were supposed to seize government buildings. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, retired but still influential, would have become Wehrmacht commander after successful coup. These men represented different motivations but shared one conclusion: Hitler must die and Nazi rule must end. The evidence linking Blaskowitz to this conspiracy is exactly zero. No documents place him in contact with plotters, no testimony from arrested conspirators mentions his name, no preparatory orders from his headquarters suggest he expected regime change. The conspiracy's organisers apparently never approached him, never sounded him out, never tried to recruit him into their dangerous enterprise. This absence is significant because conspirators did approach other generals, did test loyalties, did build networks across multiple army groups. That they didn't approach Blaskowitz suggests several possibilities. Perhaps they assumed his 1939 protests made him sympathetic, but his continued service made him unreliable. Perhaps they considered him too professionally rigid to countenance killing his commander-in-chief. Perhaps they simply couldn't reach him given his geographic isolation in southern France. The effect is the same. The general who protested SS atrocities in Poland played no role in the military conspiracy to overthrow the regime committing those atrocities. The question of why Blaskowitz didn't join the resistance illuminates the limits of his moral framework. In 1939, he protested SS crimes on professional grounds. They violated military discipline, harmed operational security, damaged troop morale. He wrote as a Prussian officer, arguing that armies should follow rules, not as a humanitarian, arguing that humans have rights. His moral calculus operated within military context: obey legitimate authority, maintain professional standards, serve competently regardless of politics. Killing Hitler, participating in a coup, violating his sworn oath to the Führer, all these actions fell outside his framework of acceptable behaviour. The oath Blaskowitz swore in 1934 bound him personally to Hitler, and Prussian officers don't break oaths, even when serving evil leaders. This worldview made him perfect for protesting specific atrocities through official channels. It made him utterly unsuitable for resistance that required treason against the state. The aftermath of July 20th reveals what happens to generals who cross lines Blaskowitz wouldn't cross. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, peripherally connected to conspirators through conversations about post-Hitler Germany but not actively involved in assassination planning, receives forced suicide in October 1944 to avoid public trial. General Karl Heinrich von Stulpnagel, military governor of France, who actively participated in the coup attempt, tries to commit suicide when it fails, botches it, and is executed after torture and show trial. General Erich Hoepner, panzer commander who joined the conspiracy, is expelled from the Wehrmacht and hanged with piano wire at Plötzensee prison. General Henning von Tresckow, the conspiracy's driving force, commits suicide on the Eastern Front when the coup fails. Approximately 160 people directly involved in the plot are executed, often after torture, their families sent to concentration camps. Hitler's revenge is systematic and thorough, designed to terrorize any remaining potential resistance. The purge extends beyond actual conspirators to anyone Hitler suspects of insufficient loyalty or excessive defeatism. The officer corps fractures under pressure. True believers denounce colleagues, careerists distance themselves from anyone suspicious, and paranoia infects military decision-making as officers worry about denunciation as much as enemy attacks. The Wehrmacht's effectiveness, already strained by material shortages and strategic overextension, suffers further as competent officers disappear into Gestapo cellars and reliable Nazis receive commands based on loyalty rather than ability. The attempt to save Germany by killing Hitler has actually strengthened his grip on the military, proving to him that even his generals cannot be trusted, justifying even more direct control of operational decisions. Through August and September 1944, while Blaskowitz conducts his fighting retreat from southern France, the purge continues in the background. He receives no visit from Gestapo investigators, faces no questions about his loyalty, encounters no suggestion he's suspected of conspiracy involvement. His 1939 protests are apparently forgotten, or at least not connected to the July coup attempt. He continues serving, continues commanding, continues executing Hitler's orders, even as those orders become increasingly delusional. When Hitler demands Marseille and Toulon be held as fortresses, Blaskowitz obeys. When retreat is necessary, Blaskowitz executes it competently. When new defensive positions must be prepared, Blaskowitz prepares them. Professional duty continues regardless of the regime's character, regardless of strategic hopelessness, regardless of the conspiracy that nearly ended Nazi rule. The contrast between Blaskowitz's 1939 memoranda and his 1944 passivity reveals evolution or perhaps calcification of his moral position. In Poland, he was shocked by SS atrocities that violated his professional standards and believed documenting crimes would prompt corrective action. By 1944, he knows documentation accomplished nothing, knows the regime is fundamentally criminal, knows Germany is losing a war that Nazi policies made inevitable, yet he continues serving because his moral framework provides no alternative. He swore an oath. He's a soldier. Soldiers obey orders, serve their country, die at their posts, if necessary. That the country is run by criminals, that the orders lead to catastrophe, that death serves no purpose beyond postponing defeat, none of this releases him from duty as he understands it. He cannot join resistance because resistance requires breaking his oath, and Prussian officers don't break oaths. He cannot resign because resigning during war is desertion, and Prussian officers don't desert. He's trapped by the code that defines his entire identity, unable to serve honourably because the regime is dishonourable, unable to stop serving because stopping means abandoning everything he's believed since entering cadet school at age 18. September 1944 finds Blaskowitz still commanding Army Group G, still fighting competently, still serving a regime he morally opposes in a war he knows is lost. The conspiracy he never joined has failed. The resistance he never supported has been crushed. The SS he protested in 1939 has spent 5 years murdering millions, while Wehrmacht generals like him continued providing the military screen behind which genocide occurred. He's a good soldier serving an evil cause, a competent general enabling monstrous policies, a moral man whose morality operates within such narrow bounds that it becomes functionally irrelevant. The questions he never answered in 1939 remain unanswered in 1944. At what point does duty become complicity? When does continuing to serve make you responsible for what your service enables? Where is the line between professional soldier and war criminal? Johannes Blaskowitz doesn't answer these questions, because his entire worldview is built on not asking them, on believing that a soldier's honour lies in competent service regardless of the cause served. That worldview, hammered into him at cadet school and reinforced by 43 years of military service, will carry him through Germany's collapse and into a reckoning he never sought and never prepared for. September 19th, 44, Netherlands. Johannes Blaskowitz receives new orders. He's being transferred from command of Army Group G to command of Army Group H, responsible for defending the Netherlands and northwestern Germany. He's replacing General Kurt Student, a paratrooper who's proven better at airborne operations than defensive strategy. The timing is significant because Blaskowitz arrives exactly as the Allies launch Operation Market Garden, that bold attempt to seize bridges across the Rhine and end the war before Christmas. British, American, and Polish paratroopers are dropping near Arnhem, Nijmegen, and Eindhoven, trying to capture Rhine crossings, while British ground forces race north to link up. It's the largest airborne operation ever attempted, and it's landing directly in Blaskowitz's new command area. He takes charge of Army Group H in the middle of a major battle, inheriting a defensive crisis that's already developing. The Battle of Arnhem, September 17th through 25th, becomes a strange victory for German forces, success achieved despite command chaos and material shortages. British 1st Airborne Division drops near Arnhem to capture the bridge there, planning to hold until ground forces arrive. But German response is far stronger than Allied intelligence predicted, partly through accident and partly through competent reaction. 2 SS Panzer divisions, 2nd SS Panzer Corps, happened to be refitting near Arnhem, putting experienced armoured troops exactly where they're most needed. Blaskowitz's forces, combined with Student's remaining command elements, react quickly to contain the airborne lodgement. British paratroopers fight desperately in Arnhem streets, but German forces cut them off from the bridge, surround their positions, and methodically destroy the division. By September 25th, Market Garden has failed. Over 8,000 British paratroopers killed, wounded, or captured. The Rhine bridges remaining in German hands. Allied advance stops short of Germany. Blaskowitz's role in Arnhem's defence is modest. He arrives mid-battle and coordinates forces already engaged rather than planning defensive strategy from scratch. But the victory, such as it is, gets credited to his command. Another entry in his record of professional competence under impossible circumstances. The reality is that German success at Arnhem results more from Allied intelligence failures and lucky SS unit positioning than from brilliant German generalship. But in September 1944, with Germany losing on every front, any defensive success receives exaggerated importance. Hitler is pleased. Army High Command issues commendations. Blaskowitz has redeemed himself enough to remain in active command despite his 1939 protests and his political unreliability. October and November bring the Battle of the Scheldt, a grinding campaign without glory or decisive moments, just Canadian forces methodically clearing German defenders from approaches to Antwerp port. The Allies captured Antwerp in early September but cannot use the port because German forces still hold both sides of the Scheldt estuary, the waterway connecting Antwerp to the North Sea. Blaskowitz's Army Group H defends the northern side, fighting from flooded polders and fortified positions, extracting maximum cost from Canadian assaults. The Canadians attack with methodical thoroughness, using overwhelming artillery and air support to reduce German strong points one after another. German resistance is stubborn but futile. Every position eventually falls to superior Allied firepower. The casualty figures from the Scheldt reveal the battle's brutal arithmetic. Canadian forces lose 12,873 killed and wounded, clearing the Scheldt approaches. suffering heavily in attacks across flooded fields against prepared German defences. German casualties are similar in absolute numbers, but far more significant proportionally and strategically. Blaskowitz's forces can't replace losses. Every casualty removes a trained soldier. Germany cannot replace. The Canadians can replace their losses from reserve divisions in Britain. German reinforcements consist of teenage conscripts with minimal training and old men from Volkssturm home defence units. By early November, the shelters cleared, Antwerp opens as a functioning Allied supply port, and Army Group H has lost irreplaceable combat power defending positions everyone knew were ultimately indefensible. The resource disparity between German and Allied forces in late 1944 makes mockery of any claim that professional competence can compensate for material inferiority. Blaskowitz's Army Group H numbers, approximately 100,000 troops, but troops is generous terminology for what he actually commands. First-line divisions have been bled white by continuous combat. Replacement divisions consist of overage soldiers, teenage conscripts, Eastern European volunteers of questionable loyalty, and men with medical conditions that would have disqualified them from service in earlier war years. The Allies facing him, Canadian First Army and British Second Army, total approximately 440,000 well-equipped, well-fed, well-trained soldiers. German forces have no air support. Allied air forces bomb German positions with impunity. German logistics depend on horse-drawn wagons because fuel shortages immobilize motor transport. Allied logistics use thousands of trucks rolling on secure supply lines from Normandy ports. November 1944 brings personal humiliation that reveals how thoroughly Hitler's favour is based on political rather than military criteria. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, loses ground in defensive operations south of Army Group H. Hitler, enraged by Model's failure to stop Allied advances, considers sacking him. But Model is too valuable, too competent, too necessary for defending the Western Front. Instead, Hitler decides Blaskowitz is responsible for setbacks in Army Group H's sector, ignores that Blaskowitz has been fighting outnumbered against superior forces, and relieves him of command. Kurt Student, whom Blaskowitz replaced in September, returns to command Army Group H. Blaskowitz receives assignment to Army Group G, now defending southwestern Germany, the same formation he commanded during the retreat from southern France. It's a demotion disguised as lateral transfer, another reminder that competent service matters less than avoiding Hitler's displeasure. January 25th, 1945. Blaskowitz is sacked again, this time from Army Group G command, officially for allowing Allied advances in Alsace. The real reason is probably more complicated. Hitler's paranoia about general staff officers, his tendency to blame commanders for defeats caused by his own strategic incompetence, his need to find scapegoats for Germany's collapsing military position. Paul Hauser, an SS general, takes over Army Group G, proving that in the war's final months, ideological reliability trumps professional competence even in desperate military circumstances. Blaskowitz faces the prospect of permanent relief, of sitting out the war's end in the reserve, of watching Germany's final defeat from the sidelines, while SS generals command Wehrmacht armies. But Germany's military situation is so catastrophic by late January 1945 that even politically suspect generals cannot be spared. Blaskowitz receives yet another command assignment, Army Group G, now redesignated after Hauser's tenure, defending southern Germany against approaching American and French armies. It's his third time commanding this formation, a bizarre command carousel that reflects Wehrmacht's organizational chaos in the war's final months. Commanders rotate through positions based on Hitler's whims and political calculations rather than military logic. The command structure has become completely dysfunctional. Generals get sacked for defeats they couldn't prevent, reassigned to different sectors where they face identical impossible missions, relieved again when they can't perform miracles with non-existent resources. The absurdity of Blaskowitz's situation in early 1945 captures Wehrmacht's complete organizational breakdown. He's commanding forces that exist primarily on paper, defending territory Germany cannot hold, executing strategic plans that make no military sense, receiving orders from a dictator whose grip on reality has vanished into bunker-fueled delusions. Allied armies are crossing the Rhine, approaching Germany from west and east, crushing resistance through overwhelming material superiority and air dominance. The Soviet Red Army is driving toward Berlin from the east, avenging years of German occupation with ruthless efficiency. Germany has lost. Everyone knows it except Hitler, who rants about secret weapons and miracle counteroffensives while German cities burn under Allied bombing. For 61-year-old Johannes Blaskowitz, the final months of war represent professional competence applied to complete strategic futility. He continues training troops who won't survive their first battle. He continues planning defensive operations everyone knows will fail. He continues serving a regime he morally opposed in a war he knows is lost, executing orders he recognizes as meaningless. The Prussian code that sustained him through 44 years of military service has become a trap. Honor requires competent service. Duty demands obedience. Professionalism means executing impossible missions with maximum efficiency. That these efforts only prolong German suffering, only extend a war that's already decided, only add to the civilian casualties and military deaths that serve no strategic purpose. None of this releases him from obligations as he understands them. He's a soldier. Soldiers serve until ordered to stop, fight until ordered to surrender, obey until authority itself dissolves. That authority is insane, criminal, and leading Germany to destruction matters less than maintaining the professional standards that define him. He will continue serving until either Germany surrenders or he dies, because professional soldiers don't choose their wars or judge their governments. They simply serve competently and let history provide judgment. March 1945, Western Germany. The Rhine River, that natural barrier German planners assumed would protect the Reich's heartland, has been breached at multiple points. American 1st and 3rd Armies cross near Remagen after capturing the Ludendorff Bridge intact on March 7th, a catastrophic German failure that allows Allies to establish bridgeheads on the Rhine's eastern bank. British and Canadian forces cross in the north near Wesel on March 23rd after massive artillery preparation and airborne assault. In Johannes Blaskowitz's southern sector, American 7th Army and French 1st Army prepare to force crossings into Baden and Bavaria. The defence lines that Hitler has ordered held at all costs are collapsing not through military incompetence but through overwhelming Allied superiority and Wehrmacht's complete exhaustion. Germany is being invaded from east and west simultaneously, compressed between Soviet armies driving from Poland and Allied armies advancing from France. Blaskowitz's Army Group G, defending southern Germany, exists more on organisational charts than in combat reality. His subordinate formations have grandiose names, 1st Army and 19th Army, but their actual strength consists of scattered divisions at fraction of authorised manpower, supplied with horse-drawn wagons because gasoline has vanished, armed with whatever weapons remain after 5.5 years of war. The soldiers Blaskowitz commands range from hardened Eastern Front veterans, transferred west after surviving Soviet offensives, to 15-year-old boys from Hitler Youth given rifles and 2 weeks training. Equipment shortages are catastrophic. Artillery lacks shells, machine guns lack ammunition, tanks lack fuel. The Luftwaffe has effectively ceased to exist in the West. Allied fighter bombers attack German positions with impunity, turning daylight movement into suicide. April brings the final collapse. American 7th Army under General Alexander Patch and French 1st Army under General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny cross the Rhine and drive deep into southern Germany. Blaskowitz attempts to conduct fighting retreat, establishing defensive positions at rivers and cities, trying to slow Allied advance enough to buy time for what? There is no strategic purpose anymore, no relief force coming, no miracle weapons that will change the war's outcome. Hitler rants about Alpine Redoubt, a fortified zone in the Bavarian mountains where German forces will hold out indefinitely. But it's pure fantasy. There are no fortifications, no supply stockpiles, no plan beyond Hitler's delusion that willpower can compensate for material reality. Blaskowitz continues retreating because retreat is the only option besides surrender, and surrender requires authorization from Hitler, who will never give it. April 29th, 1945, Bavaria. American 45th Infantry Division, advancing through southern Germany, liberates Dachau concentration camp near Munich. What they find there stops hardened combat soldiers in their tracks with horror and rage. 30,000 survivors, living skeletons barely alive, 2,000 corpses stacked like cordwood. Railway. Cars filled with bodies of prisoners who died during evacuation from other camps. The SS guards, faced with American fury, try to surrender. Some are shot on the spot by outraged GIs. Dachau is not the worst camp, not the largest killing centre, but it's in Bavaria, in Army Group G's operational area, in territory. Blaskowitz has been defending through April as German forces retreat eastward. The question it raises is inescapable. What did Blaskowitz know? When did he know it? The documented record of Blaskowitz's knowledge about concentration camps is frustratingly incomplete. He was never posted in Poland after 1940, never commanded in the East where the worst extermination camps operated, never involved in Holocaust administration. But Dachau opened in 1933, existed for 12 years as imprisonment and murder centre for political prisoners, Jews, and others the Nazis deemed undesirable. It was not secret in the sense of being unknown. Germans knew concentration camps existed, knew people were sent there, knew the sent rarely returned. What most Germans didn't know, or chose not to know, was the systematic murder, the gas chambers and crematoriums, the industrial-scale genocide. Whether Blaskowitz specifically knew about Dachau's conditions, whether he entered the camp during April's fighting retreat, whether he even thought about the camps while managing military crisis, none of this appears in surviving documents. The moral question the camps raise cannot be avoided by lack of specific documentary evidence. Blaskowitz commanded Army Group G, defending the territory where Dachau operated. His headquarters tracked Allied advances, knew American forces were approaching Munich, must have known about the camp's existence and location, even if he personally never went there. In 1939, he documented SS atrocities because they violated professional military standards and damaged operational security. In 1945, those atrocities had grown from thousands of murdered Polish civilians to millions of murdered Jews, from sporadic killings to systematic genocide. The general who wrote memoranda protesting the beginning of Holocaust never wrote similar documents about its culmination, never filed official protests about extermination camps, never demanded SS answer for crimes that dwarfed the Polish atrocities he'd documented 6 years earlier. April 30th, 1945, Berlin. Adolf Hitler, surrounded in his Führer bunker by advancing Soviet armies, commits suicide with his new wife, Eva Braun. The news reaches German military commands through fragmentary, often contradictory reports. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's designated successor, takes nominal command of what remains of the German government and armed forces. But the change in command means nothing practically. Germany has lost, the war is ending, surrender is days away. In southern Germany, Blaskowitz receives news of Hitler's death and continues ordering resistance because no surrender authorization has arrived. The oath he swore in 1934 was personal, to Hitler specifically, not to the German state or constitution. Hitler is dead, the oath theoretically void. But military chain of command still functions and Dönitz hasn't ordered surrender. So, fighting continues, soldiers die, civilians suffer for another week while bureaucracy catches up to reality. May 5th, 1945, Bavaria. Blaskowitz negotiates surrender of Army Group G to American forces, approximately 400,000 troops, laying down weapons and entering captivity. It's one of the largest single Wehrmacht surrenders, an entire army group acknowledging defeat and choosing prison over pointless continued resistance. The negotiations are professional and brief. Blaskowitz meets American commanders, discusses surrender terms, ensures his soldiers will be treated according to Geneva Convention rather than massacred or turned over to Soviet forces. American officers, meeting this German general who commanded forces that fought competently until the end, treat him with professional respect. They don't yet know about his 1939 memoranda. They don't yet know he'll be charged with war crimes. They see a defeated enemy general surrendering with dignity, not a potential war criminal facing justice. May 8th brings official German capitulation, the formal end of war in Europe. In American POW cages across southern Germany, hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers wait to learn their fate. Some will be released quickly, deemed no threat to Allied occupation. Others will remain in prison for years, held for war crimes, investigation, or simply because the Allies don't know what to do with millions of captured enemies. High-ranking officers, generals and admirals who commanded major formations face automatic investigation. Allied prosecutors are building cases for war crimes, trials, going through captured German documents, identifying commanders who might be charged with atrocities or violations of laws of war. Johannes Blaskowitz, as Army Group Commander, is automatically flagged for investigation. His name goes onto lists being compiled for potential prosecution. The final weeks of war have forced Blaskowitz to confront the ultimate consequences of the regime he protested but served. The concentration camps now liberated by Allied armies reveal the full scope of Nazi genocide. 6 million Jews murdered, millions more killed, for being Slavic, Roma, disabled, politically unreliable, or otherwise designated as subhuman by Nazi racial ideology. The Holocaust that began with the Polish killings Blaskowitz documented in 1939 has culminated in industrialized murder exceeding anything he could have imagined when writing his memoranda. He served the regime that committed these crimes for all 6 years of war, commanded armies in territories where atrocities occurred, continued professional military service while genocide unfolded behind the front lines. His protests in Poland, sincere as they were, accomplished nothing. His continued service, competent as it was, enabled everything. For Blaskowitz personally, surrender brings not relief, but the beginning of a new ordeal. He's 61 years old, physically exhausted from months of retreat and defeat, facing an uncertain future as prisoner of war. The Americans treat him correctly, according to Geneva Convention, but make clear that senior German officers face war crimes investigation. He's moved from initial capture point to more secure power facilities, joining other captured generals. Some who eagerly collaborated with Nazis, some who quietly resisted, most who fell somewhere between. They wait together for Allied prosecutors to determine which generals will face trial, which crimes merit prosecution, which defendants will hang, and which will merely serve prison terms. Blaskowitz waits with them, knowing his 1939 memorandum might provide defense, but also knowing that continued service through 1945 might provide prosecution evidence. He protested crimes, then continued enabling the regime, committing them. He documented atrocities, then kept serving competently. He wrote that Wehrmacht soldiers were ashamed of SS actions, then spent 6 more years commanding Wehrmacht forces. Whether that service makes him guilty of war crimes, complicit in atrocities, or simply a professional soldier following orders, American prosecutors will decide. The reckoning he never sought, for crimes he opposed but couldn't stop, has finally arrived. May 1945, Allendorf, Germany. The American POW facility for captured Wehrmacht generals fills with familiar faces from newsreels and wanted lists. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, defender of Italy, General Heinz Guderian, panzer theorist and Eastern Front commander, dozens of corps and army commanders whose decisions shaped the war's course. They're housed in former German military barracks, guarded by American soldiers, awaiting decision on their fate. Johannes Blaskowitz arrives at Allendorf in mid-May, processed like the other captured generals. Photographed, fingerprinted, interrogated about military service and party affiliation, assigned prisoner number. The Americans segregate senior officers from regular Wehrmacht prisoners, recognizing that generals face different legal calculus than conscripted soldiers. Some of these officers will be witnesses in coming trials. Some will be defendants. All face uncertainty about whether professional military service under criminal regime constitutes crime itself. The interrogations begin within weeks of capture. American officers, working with prosecutors preparing for war crimes trials, question captured generals systematically about military operations, knowledge of atrocities, cooperation with SS, enforcement of criminal orders. Blaskowitz faces multiple interrogation sessions through summer 1945, answering questions about his entire military career, but particularly about Poland in 1939 and 40. The interrogators discover Blaskowitz's memoranda in captured German archives, those detailed reports documenting SS crimes in occupied Poland. The discovery creates confusion about how to categorize him. Is he a war criminal who commanded forces during atrocities, Or is he a resistor who opposed Nazi policies? Can he be both protester and perpetrator, documenting crimes while commanding forces in territories where crimes occurred? June through October 1945 witnessed the building of cases for Nuremberg trials. The International Military Tribunal, established by London Agreement among the four major Allied powers, will try the most prominent Nazi leaders on charges of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Parallel to the major trial, American prosecutors plan subsequent trials focusing on specific institutions and organizations: the SS, the Einsatzgruppen, the ministries, and the Wehrmacht High Command. This last trial poses special challenges because it requires distinguishing professional military service from criminal participation, determining when following orders becomes criminal action, judging whether commanders are responsible for crimes committed by forces they controlled. Every Wehrmacht general in Allied custody faces potential inclusion in these trials. November 1945 brings Blaskowitz's transfer from Allendorf to Nuremberg, the Bavarian city where the major war crimes trials will occur. The Palace of Justice has been refurbished to accommodate trials on unprecedented scale: courtroom for international tribunal, prison cells for defendants and witnesses, offices for prosecutors and defense attorneys, translation facilities for trials conducted in 4 languages. Blaskowitz moves into the prison wing, joining other military prisoners awaiting trial. The initial major trial, beginning November 20, prosecutes 24 top Nazi leaders, including Hermann Göring, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, Albert Speer, and others who shaped Nazi policy. Blaskowitz watches this trial from his cell, uncertain whether he'll face similar prosecution or serve as witness against other defendants. December 1945 through 1947, Blaskowitz remains in Nuremberg custody while American prosecutors continue building their case list. The legal questions are genuinely difficult. Blaskowitz commanded armies during aggressive war, which is itself designated a crime under the London Charter establishing tribunal jurisdiction. He commanded forces in occupied territories where atrocities occurred, making him potentially liable under command responsibility doctrine. But he also documented SS crimes and protested them through military channels, which suggests he opposed the atrocities and attempted to stop them. The prosecutors must decide whether his protests mitigate his liability, whether command during atrocities makes him guilty regardless of personal actions, whether continued service after protests failed constitutes complicity in crimes he documented. The comparative cases offer little clear guidance. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, tried at Main Nuremberg trial, is convicted and hanged in October 1946 for signing criminal orders and serving as Hitler's compliant tool in Wehrmacht. Admiral Karl Dönitz receives 10 years for unrestricted submarine warfare. Hermann Göring commits suicide before execution. But these are top leadership policymakers who shaped Nazi war conduct. The generals who commanded armies and army groups, who were far enough down the chain of command to claim they followed orders, but senior enough to have known about crimes, occupy ambiguous legal space. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein will eventually be tried by British military court and convicted of war crimes, receiving 18 years later reduced to 12. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring receives death sentence for Italian massacre reprisals, later commuted to life, later reduced again. The sentences vary wildly based on specific charges, evidence quality, and which Allied power conducts the trial. January 1948 brings Blaskowitz's formal designation as defendant in case number 12, the High Command trial. American prosecutors charge 14 Wehrmacht generals and admirals with conspiracy to commit war crimes, crimes against peace, and violations of laws of war. Blaskowitz's co-defendants include Field Marshal Wilhelm List, who commanded in Balkans where Wehrmacht conducted brutal anti-partisan operations, General Hermann Hoth, whose panzer armies fought in the east, with cooperation with SS killing operations, Admiral Karl Wilhelm Böhm, charged with deportation of Danish Jews, and 11 others whose commands are linked to specific atrocities or criminal operations. The charges against Blaskowitz focus on his command of Army Group G, specifically alleging he's responsible for crimes committed in territories his forces controlled and occupied, including deportation of civilians, plunder of occupied territories, and failing to prevent or punish atrocities. The specific evidence against Blaskowitz is weaker than against some co-defendants, but still substantial. Prosecutors note that he commanded forces during the 1939 Poland campaign when initial SS killings occurred, making him present at Holocaust's beginning, even if he protested it. They document that Army Group G operated in southern Germany where Dachau and other camps existed, creating potential command responsibility for failing to prevent or terminate camp operations. They cite his continued service through 6 years of war as evidence of complicity, arguing that resignation would have been appropriate response to crimes he claimed to oppose. They present his military competence, his successful retreats and defensive operations as evidence that he strengthened the Nazi regime's ability to continue fighting and therefore continue genocide. The defense evidence is equally substantial but points in opposite direction. Blaskowitz's attorneys discover his 1939 and 40 memoranda in prosecution files and immediately make them centerpiece of defense case. Here are detailed documents proving Blaskowitz not only knew about atrocities but formally protested them, documented specific incidents, demanded higher authority intervene. Defense argues these memoranda demonstrate Blaskowitz opposed Nazi criminal policies from the earliest stages, that he fulfilled officer's duty by reporting crimes through proper channels, that he cannot be held responsible when military and political superiors ignored his protests. They argue that resignation would have accomplished nothing except removing one of the few generals who opposed SS operations. That continued service was an attempt to maintain professional military standards in criminal system. They present testimony from former subordinates describing Blaskowitz as a political professional who maintained discipline and opposed SS influence in military operations. February 1948 brings trial preparations to completion. The prosecution has its evidence compiled, its witness list prepared, its legal arguments structured. The defense has reviewed charges, prepared responses, identified witnesses who will testify to Blaskowitz's anti-Nazi attitudes and professional conduct. Blaskowitz himself has spent weeks with his attorneys, reviewing his military career, explaining his memoranda, preparing to testify about his actions and motivations. The trial will answer questions about command responsibility, about whether protesting crimes absolves continued service, about where the line falls between professional, soldier, and war criminal. Blaskowitz will finally have chance to explain publicly why he wrote those memoranda, why he continued serving despite their failure, what he believed his duty required in impossible circumstances. The prosecution will argue his service enabled atrocities regardless of personal objections. The defense will argue he did everything an officer could do within military system. The tribunal will judge whether protest without resistance constitutes defense or merely evidence of knowledge without action. February 5th, 1948, Blaskowitz is scheduled to testify that day, finally bringing his voice to the legal proceeding that will determine his guilt or innocence, his responsibility or exoneration. He has lived with these questions for nearly 3 years of captivity, knowing that his 1939 protests will be examined, his continued service judged, his actions or inactions measured against unprecedented legal standards. The testimony he's prepared represents his defense, not just in legal sense, but in historical sense. His explanation of what he believed, what he tried to do, what limits constrained him. It's his chance to speak for himself rather than letting documents and witnesses speak about him. But February 5th will not bring that testimony. Instead, it will bring an ending no one anticipated. A final act that transforms Blaskowitz from defendant into enigma, ensuring that the questions his testimony might have answered will never receive definitive resolution. Late 1947, Nuremberg. The American prosecution team working on Case 12, the High Command trial, gathers in their offices surrounded by thousands of pages of captured German documents. They're building cases against 14 Wehrmacht generals and admirals, trying to distinguish between professional military service and criminal conduct to identify where legitimate warfare ended and war crimes began. The Blaskowitz file creates particular difficulty because it contains evidence pointing in contradictory directions, documents proving he commanded forces when atrocities occurred, and documents proving he protested those same atrocities. Lead prosecutor Telford Taylor, who supervised all subsequent Nuremberg trials after the main tribunal, understands the problem. Prosecute Blaskowitz too aggressively, and they risk appearing to punish the one general who actually documented SS crimes. Prosecute too weakly, and they risk suggesting that filing a memorandum absolves responsibility for 6 years of continued service. The legal framework for the High Command trial derives from the London Charter establishing the Nuremberg Tribunal and from international law principles about command responsibility. 3 categories of charges: structure the prosecution, crimes against peace, meaning planning and waging aggressive war crimes, meaning violations of laws and customs of war, and crimes against humanity, meaning persecution and extermination of civilian populations. Each defendant faces some combination of these charges based on their specific military positions and actions. The challenge is proving individual criminal responsibility rather than simply collective guilt, demonstrating that specific generals made specific decisions that violated international law. For Blaskowitz, the prosecution must prove either that he directly ordered criminal actions or that he knew about crimes committed by forces under his command and failed to prevent or punish them. The evidence against Blaskowitz focuses on command responsibility, the legal doctrine holding commanders liable for crimes committed by subordinates when the commander knew or should have known about the crimes and failed to take reasonable action to prevent or punish them. Prosecutors note that Blaskowitz commanded 8th Army during the 1939 Poland campaign when Einsatzgruppen murders began. His memoranda prove he knew about SS atrocities, which prosecution argues establishes knowledge, element of command responsibility. But the memoranda also prove he reported the crimes and demanded action, which defense argues fulfills commander's duty to address subordinate misconduct. The prosecution counters that Blaskowitz continued commanding forces in occupied Poland for months after his protests were ignored, that continued service constituted acquiescence to crimes he documented. The legal question becomes whether filing protests absolves commander from responsibility when protests fail and crimes continue. The prosecution also examines Blaskowitz's later commands, particularly Army Group G in France and Germany during the war's final year. They document that his operational area included concentration camps, that Wehrmacht forces under his command provided security and logistical support for SS operations, that the retreating army he led fought through territory where genocide was systematically implemented. They argue that by 1944, Blaskowitz certainly knew about the Holocaust's full scope, that continued professional military service strengthened the Nazi regime's ability to continue genocide, that competent defense of German territory prolonged the war and therefore prolonged mass murder. This argument essentially claims that any Wehrmacht general serving in 1944 and 45 is complicit in Holocaust simply through continued service, that resignation or active resistance was morally required once genocide's scope became clear. The defense evidence complicates this straightforward prosecution narrative. Blaskowitz's 1939 memoranda are remarkably detailed and legally sophisticated, documenting 54 specific incidents with dates, locations, units involved, and numbers killed. They use language of military law and professional standards, arguing that SS crimes violate both international conventions and military discipline. The February 1940 memorandum explicitly states that Wehrmacht soldiers experience abhorrence and hatred toward SS units, that military discipline suffers when troops witness atrocities, that German strategic interests are harmed by terror tactics that unite occupied populations against all German forces. Defense attorneys argue these memoranda demonstrate Blaskowitz understood he was witnessing crimes, that he reported them through proper military channels, that he demanded higher authority intervene. What more could a general do while maintaining his position and ability to influence events? Witness testimony provides additional defense evidence. Former Wehrmacht officers who served under Blaskowitz describe him as a political professional who never joined the Nazi Party, never attended party functions, never made ideological speeches to his troops. They testify that he maintained strict military discipline, that he prevented his soldiers from participating in SS operations when he had authority to do so, that he was known throughout Wehrmacht as one of the few generals who openly opposed Nazi influence in military affairs. Several witnesses mention that Blaskowitz's career suffered because of his opposition, that he was repeatedly sidelined or given secondary commands, while ideologically reliable generals like Reich received prestigious assignments. This testimony supports defense argument that Blaskowitz paid personal price for his moral stance, that continued service despite career damage demonstrates commitment to maintaining professional standards within criminal system. The prosecution counters this defense narrative by examining what Blaskowitz didn't do. He never resigned his command in protest when his memoranda were ignored. He never joined military resistance, never participated in plots against Hitler, never took active measures to obstruct SS operations beyond filing official complaints. He continued serving competently through 6 years of war, commanding forces in Poland, France, the Netherlands, and Germany, always executing his military missions with professional excellence, regardless of regime's criminal character. Prosecutors argue this continued service, this professional competence applied to Nazi objectives, constitutes participation in criminal enterprise regardless of personal objections. They cite the precedent from the main Nuremberg trial. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel claimed he merely followed orders, that he personally opposed many Hitler directives, that he argued against criminal policies. The tribunal convicted and hanged him anyway, holding that senior military leaders cannot hide behind following orders, defense, when they knowingly serve criminal regime. The comparative cases from other Wehrmacht generals create confused legal landscape. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, tried by British military court, was convicted primarily for Eastern Front operations where Wehrmacht forces cooperated with SS killing operations and implemented scorched earth policies. He received 18 years later reduced. General Gotthard Heinrici, who commanded on Eastern Front and witnessed massive atrocities, was never charged with war crimes. British investigators determined he hadn't directly ordered criminal actions and had actually attempted to mitigate brutality. Admiral Karl Dönitz served only 10 years despite commanding U-boat forces that attacked merchant shipping, partly because prosecution couldn't prove he'd committed crimes distinct from standard naval warfare. The sentences range from execution to acquittal, from life imprisonment to brief detention, with no clear standard for what level of knowledge and what degree of participation constitute criminal guilt. January 1948, prosecutors finalised charges against all 14 defendants in high command trial. Blaskowitz faces 4 counts: conspiracy to commit war crimes, crimes against peace aggressive, war crimes, command responsibility for atrocities, and plunder of occupied territories. The plunder charge stems from standard Wehrmacht practice of requisitioning supplies from occupied areas, a practice that technically violates Hague Convention rules, but that every army in human history has practiced to some degree. The aggressive war charge applies to all defendants who commanded forces during German invasions of Poland, France, Soviet Union, and other countries. The command responsibility charge is most serious. It alleges Blaskowitz knew or should have known about crimes committed in territories he controlled and failed to prevent or punish them. The conspiracy charge, claiming Blaskowitz participated in overall Nazi plan to commit atrocities, is hardest to prove given his documented protests. February 1948 brings trial beginning. Prosecutors present opening arguments. The Wehrmacht was not merely military organisation following international law, integral part of Nazi criminal enterprise. Generals who commanded major formations cannot claim ignorance of atrocities or innocence through following orders. Professional competence in service of criminal regime is not defence but aggravating factor. The defence responds that soldiers must follow legitimate government orders, that resignation would have accomplished nothing except removing officers who attempted to maintain professional standards, that commanders who protested crimes and reported them fulfilled their legal obligations. Both sides present their cases, knowing that Blaskowitz's testimony will be crucial. Here is defendant, who can personally explain what Wehrmacht generals knew, what they tried to do, what limitations constrained them. His memoranda make him unique among defendants, the one who documented early atrocities and protested them. What he says on the stand will illuminate the moral and legal questions at the trial's heart. February 5th, 1948. Blaskowitz is scheduled to testify that afternoon. The morning of February 5th finds him in his cell, probably reviewing testimony plans with his attorneys, preparing for cross-examination he knows will be aggressive. The prosecutors plan to ask him why he continued serving after his protests failed, whether he knew about extermination camps, what he believed duty required when serving criminal government. The defence plans to walk him through his memoranda, to let him explain in his own words why he documented atrocities, what he hoped to accomplish, why he believed working with a military system was more effective than resignation or resistance. His testimony promises to be the trial's dramatic centerpiece, the moment when Wehrmacht's relationship with Nazi crimes receives explanation from general who experienced the moral crisis firsthand. But that testimony will never happen. By evening, February 5th, Johannes Blaskowitz will be dead, his explanations will remain unspoken, and his trial will continue without its most important witness, the defendant himself. February 4th, 1948, evening. Nuremberg Palace of Justice, the prison wing where high command trial defendants are held. Johannes Blaskowitz spends what will be his last evening, much as he's spent hundreds of evenings before, in his cell, reviewing documents with his defense attorney, preparing for testimony scheduled for the next day. Guards report nothing unusual in his demeanour. He's calm, focused, engaged with legal preparation. He's 64 years old, his health declining after 3 years of imprisonment, but there's no indication he's contemplating anything besides tomorrow's testimony. Other prisoners in the wing include his co-defendants, Field Marshal Wilhelm List, General Hermann Hoff, and 11 others facing similar charges. They communicate during exercise periods, share information about trial proceedings, support each other through the ordeal of being judged for military service they still believe was professional duty. The guards maintain strict security, but treat the elderly generals with basic courtesy. These are not concentration camp guards or SS killers, but career soldiers facing legal reckoning. The night passes without incident that anyone notices. Guards conduct regular cell checks throughout the night, standard procedure for high-value prisoners. At each check, Blaskowitz appears to be sleeping normally. The prison cells are austere but adequate. Bed, small table, toilet facilities, nothing that could be used as weapon or means of escape. The windows are high and barred. The doors are locked and guarded. Security is designed to prevent escape, suicide, or assault, and it's generally effective. Only one previous Nuremberg defendant succeeded in committing suicide, Hermann Goering, who obtained cyanide through still mysterious means and killed himself hours before scheduled execution. The guards believe that level of security prevents prisoners from harming themselves even if they were inclined to try. February 5th, 1948, approximately 7 o'clock in the morning. A guard conducting routine early check finds Blaskowitz's cell empty, the bed unused, the prisoner missing. Alarm sounds immediately. Escape from Nuremberg prison would be catastrophic embarrassment and security failure. Guards race through the building, searching for the missing general, checking doors and windows, trying to determine how he could have left a locked cell. Minutes later, they find him. In the prison's interior courtyard, 3 stories below the window of a corridor adjacent to the cell block, his body on the stone paving, dead from the fall. The window above is open, a 3rd-floor corridor window that prisoners shouldn't have had access to, but apparently did, during morning movement to washroom facilities. The American military police secure the scene immediately, treating it as potential crime scene until investigation determines what happened. Medical personnel confirm death, obvious from the fall's impact. Prison officials notify court authorities. Defendant Blaskowitz will not be appearing for scheduled testimony because Defendant Blaskowitz is dead. The trial, set to resume at 9 o'clock with Blaskowitz on the stand, halts while officials determine how to proceed. The other defendants, gathered in holding area, awaiting transport to courtroom, learn that their co-defendant has died. Some react with shock, others with suspicion, all with the awareness that Blaskowitz's death changes the trial's dynamics. His absence means his memoranda will be introduced as evidence without his personal explanation. His protests will be documented without his voice to contextualize them. The investigation proceeds rapidly because American authorities need to determine if this was suicide, accident, or murder. The physical evidence points strongly to suicide. Blaskowitz somehow accessed the corridor window during early morning movement, climbed through it, and fell or jumped 3 stories to the courtyard below. The window was accessible, though prisoners weren't supposed to be in that corridor unsupervised. No evidence suggests anyone else was involved. No witnesses saw anyone push him or assist him. The height of the window, the trajectory of the fall, Everything indicates he went through that window alone. But was it intentional suicide or accident? Could an elderly man have fallen accidentally while, what? Looking out? Attempting something else? The official conclusion reached after investigation is suicide. Blaskowitz deliberately went through that window, knowing the fall would kill him. No suicide note is found. Blaskowitz left no written explanation, no final statement, no message to family or attorneys or anyone else. His last documented communication is routine legal consultation with his defense attorney the previous evening, nothing suggesting suicidal ideation or farewell. If he planned this, he planned it without sharing intention with anyone. The absence of note means his motivation must be inferred rather than known. Was he despairing about trial outcome? Ashamed of being charged as war criminal? Unable to face cross-examination about continued service to regime he morally opposed? Suffering from depression or medical problems that made continued imprisonment unbearable? Or was this impulsive decision made in early morning moment of despair, not carefully planned but suddenly executed? The silence he leaves behind permits no certain answer. The timing is significant because it occurs hours before scheduled testimony. Blaskowitz would have taken the stand that day, would have explained his memoranda, answered questions about why he continued serving after protests failed. His testimony would have been emotional centre of trial, the defendant who could speak to Wehrmacht generals' knowledge and complicity, the officer who documented crimes while continuing to serve. Instead, the trial continues, without him. His voice permanently silenced, his explanations forever unspoken. The prosecutors lose their chance to cross-examine him about command responsibility and continued service. The defence loses their chance to let him explain his moral reasoning in his own words. The tribunal loses the testimony that might have illuminated the difficult questions about duty and complicity the trial was designed to answer. The afternoon of February 5th proceeds with grim bureaucratic efficiency. Medical examiner completes autopsy. Cause of death is trauma from fall, age and health factors are noted but not significant. Prison officials complete incident report. Prisoner accessed unsecured window. Evidence indicates suicide. Security procedures will be reviewed. Court officials prepare modified trial schedule. Blaskowitz's testimony will not occur. His defence will proceed with other witnesses and documentary evidence. Prosecutors will present evidence against him for historical record. Though his death ends his personal liability, the other 13 defendants continue facing charges. One defendant's death doesn't halt the entire trial. Legal proceedings adapt and continue. The question of why Blaskowitz committed suicide the morning of his scheduled testimony remains subject to interpretation and speculation. One possibility, he feared cross-examination would force him to acknowledge that continued service after his protests failed constituted complicity in crimes he documented, that he couldn't defend his choice to remain in Wehrmacht service through 6 years of genocide. Another possibility, he believed his memoranda provided complete defence and that testifying would only give prosecutors opportunity to muddy his record, that his documents spoke more clearly than any testimony could. A third possibility, depression, despair at facing trial for service he still believed was professional duty, inability to accept that documenting crimes didn't absolve continued service enabling those crimes. Or perhaps simpler, an old man exhausted by imprisonment, facing hostile interrogation, recognising he would be convicted regardless of testimony, choosing death over continued ordeal. February 5th, 1948, ends with Johannes Blaskowitz buried hastily in Nuremberg military cemetery. His death officially recorded, his trial proceeding without him. His suicide transforms him from defendant to historical enigma, from general facing judgment to figure whose motivations and moral reasoning remain forever uncertain. The memoranda he wrote in 1939 survive him, powerful evidence of early Holocaust awareness and protest. But the testimony he would have given in 1948 dies, with him taking to the grave his explanation of why protest without resistance seemed sufficient, why continued service, despite failed complaints, seemed honourable, why professional duty seemed to justify enabling regime he morally opposed. The questions his death leaves unanswered will haunt historical judgment as surely as his protests documented crimes. He becomes, through suicide, simultaneously more sympathetic and more suspect. Sympathetic because his death suggests genuine moral anguish. Suspect because killing himself prevented answering for choices that enabled atrocity. The general who documented conscience has escaped judgment by conscience's torment. February 1948, Nuremberg. The High Command trial continues despite Blaskowitz's death. The remaining 13 defendants facing charges that collectively seek to establish Wehrmacht's institutional complicity in Nazi crimes. The prosecution adapts quickly, introducing Blaskowitz's memoranda into evidence as examples of Wehrmacht knowledge about atrocities. But now those documents serve different purpose. Instead of being explained by their author, they're interpreted by prosecutors who argue they prove generals knew about crimes and continued serving anyway. The defense has lost its most powerful witness, the general who could personally testify about attempting to work within military system to oppose SS atrocities. His memoranda remain, but without his voice to contextualize them, they become contested evidence subject to competing interpretations. Through spring and summer 1948, testimony proceeds with numbing detail. Prosecutors present captured German documents proving Wehrmacht cooperation with SS killing operations, orders authorizing reprisals against civilians, reports describing anti-partisan operations that were actually cover for murdering Jewish populations. They present the Kommissar order, that directive to execute Soviet political officers without trial, signed by Wilhelm Keitel and distributed to every Wehrmacht unit on Eastern Front. They document the severity orders issued by Field Marshals Reichenau and Manstein, explicitly directing troops to support elimination of Jewish populations. They show that Wehrmacht provided logistical support, transportation, security cordons, and sometimes personnel for SS mass shooting operations. The documentary evidence is overwhelming. Wehrmacht wasn't innocent bystander to Holocaust, but active participant at institutional level. The defense counters with arguments about military duty, necessity, and limited individual responsibility. They argue that soldiers must follow legitimate government orders, that refusing orders means court-martial and execution, that individual generals couldn't change government policies. They present evidence that some defendants attempted to mitigate brutality, issuing orders to treat prisoners correctly, punishing soldiers who murdered civilians, refusing to enforce particularly criminal directives. They argue that continued service was an attempt to maintain professional standards and protect soldiers under their command, that resignation would have accomplished nothing, except installing more Nazi-sympathetic replacements. Its variation on the following orders defense that failed at May Nuremberg trial, adapted to argue that Wehrmacht generals operated under constraints that limited their ability to oppose regime policies. The months of testimony reveal stark variations in defendant behaviour and culpability. Field Marshal Wilhelm List commanded in Balkans, where Wehrmacht conducted brutal anti-partisan operations involving mass executions of civilians. Evidence shows he signed orders authorizing collective punishments and reprisals, far exceeding military necessity. General Hermann Hoth commanded panzer armies in the Soviet Union, where cooperation with SS killing operations was systematic and documented. His orders explicitly reference racial war and need to eliminate Jewish Bolshevik threat. General Walter Warlimont served in OKW operations staff, where criminal orders were drafted and distributed. His fingerprints are literally on documents authorizing war crimes. These defendants have difficulty distancing themselves from crimes their signatures authorized. Other defendants have more ambiguous records. General Hans Reinhardt commanded on Eastern Front, but can document attempts to enforce military discipline and prevent unnecessary brutality. Admiral Karl Wilhelm Böhm faces charges related to Danish Jews' deportation, but evidence of his personal involvement is thin. General Hermann Reinecke commanded POW administration and faces charges for horrific treatment of Soviet prisoners, but he claims higher authorities determined policy while he merely administered camps. The prosecution must prove individual criminal responsibility, not just collective guilt, and evidence quality varies significantly across defendants. Some will clearly be convicted, others might be acquitted. All face judgment on specific acts, rather than general Wehrmacht membership. October 27th, 1948. Verdicts announced. Of the 14 original defendants, 1 is dead, leaving 13 to face judgment. The tribunal acquits 2 defendants, finding evidence insufficient to prove individual criminal responsibility for their actions. The remaining 11 received convictions on various counts with sentences ranging from 3 years to life imprisonment, later reduced on appeal. Field Marshal Wilhelm List receives life sentence for Balkan's atrocities. General Hermann Hoth receives 15 years for Eastern Front crimes. General Walter Warlimont gets life sentence later, reduced to 18 years. The pattern in sentencing reflects prosecution success proving command responsibility. Generals who demonstrably knew about crimes failed to prevent them and sometimes facilitated them receive harsh sentences. Generals whose personal involvement is less clear receive lighter punishment. Blaskowitz's case remains unresolved in formal sense because his death ended his prosecution. But the tribunal addresses his conduct in its written judgment, noting his memoranda as evidence that some Wehrmacht generals recognized SS actions as criminal. The judgment states that Blaskowitz's protests demonstrate generals could and did object to atrocities when they chose to, which undermines defense claims that objection was impossible. But the tribunal also notes that Blaskowitz continued commanding forces for 6 years after his protests failed, which suggests that filing complaints didn't constitute sufficient action to absolve command responsibility. The judgment implies, without stating explicitly, that Blaskowitz would likely have been convicted had he lived to receive verdict. His memoranda proved knowledge. His continued service constituted failure to prevent crimes he documented. The sentence he would have received remains speculation, but legal scholars examining the trial evidence generally estimate 5 to 10 years based on comparative cases. The impact of Blaskowitz's memoranda extends beyond their use. In his specific case, prosecutors cite them in judgments against other defendants as proof that Wehrmacht leadership knew about atrocities from the war's earliest stages, that claims of ignorance are not credible, that failure to protest or prevent crimes was conscious choice rather than institutional impossibility. The February 1940 memorandum, with its stark language about Wehrmacht soldiers' abhorrence and hatred of SS actions, becomes frequently quoted evidence that German military personnel recognized they were witnessing crimes. Defense arguments that generals didn't know or couldn't act are undermined by a documented example of a general who knew and acted, even if his actions proved insufficient. The legal precedents established by high command trial prove more important than individual verdicts. The tribunal confirms that following orders is not absolute defense against charges of war crimes, that commanders have duty to refuse manifestly criminal orders, that continued service under regime conducting genocide can constitute criminal participation. The judgment establishes command responsibility principles. Commanders are liable for crimes committed by subordinates when they knew or should have known about crimes and failed to take reasonable action to prevent or punish them. These principles influence subsequent war crimes, prosecutions, and eventually become codified in international humanitarian law. The trial confirms that being a professional soldier doesn't exempt one from moral and legal accountability for actions taken in service of criminal regime. The Cold War's political impact on the verdicts becomes apparent within few years. By 1951, with West Germany being rearmed as NATO ally against Soviet threat, American and British authorities begin releasing imprisoned Wehrmacht generals. Practical considerations. Trump justice. NATO needs military expertise. West German public opposes imprisoning generals they see as patriots. Cold War priorities require focusing on Soviet threat rather than continuing to punish German officers. Many convicted generals serve only few years of their sentences before early release or sentence commutation. Field Marshal Kesselring, sentenced to death and then life imprisonment for Italian massacres, is released in 1952. Field Marshal Manstein, convicted by British court and sentenced to 18 years, is released in 1953. By mid-1950s, almost all convicted Wehrmacht generals are free, their early release suggesting that moral accountability matters less than geopolitical convenience. The question of what would have happened to Blaskowitz had he lived remains counterfactual but instructive. Based on comparative cases and his specific circumstances, he would likely have been convicted on command responsibility charges, probably sentenced to 5 to 10 years, and almost certainly released within 3 to 5 years, given the pattern of early releases. He might have lived another decade after release, written memoirs defending his service, participated in Wehrmacht veterans organizations that promoted clean Wehrmacht mythology, or he might have lived quietly, refusing to justify actions he still believed were professional duty. His suicide in February 1948 denied him opportunity to experience the Cold War rehabilitation that restored many Wehrmacht generals to respectability, to see his memoranda cited in war crimes trials but his continued service largely forgotten, to witness how rapidly Allied powers moved from judging German generals to recruiting them as allies against new enemies. 1950s. West Germany. The Federal Republic emerges from Allied occupation with collective amnesia about Wehrmacht's role in Nazi crimes. German veterans' organizations promote the clean Wehrmacht myth. The army fought honorably. Only the SS committed atrocities. Soldiers cannot be blamed for following orders from legitimate government. In this narrative, Johannes Blaskowitz appears as hero, the general who protested SS crimes, proof that Wehrmacht had conscience. His memoranda are mentioned selectively, evidence of his moral courage, while his 6 years of continued service after the memoranda failed is quietly forgotten. German military culture in the 50s needs heroes who weren't Nazis, officers who maintained professional standards while serving criminal regime. Blaskowitz, dead and unable to complicate his own legacy, fits this need perfectly. He becomes symbol of resistance without actually having resisted, conscience without consequences. 1960s bring first serious historical scholarship examining Wehrmacht's relationship with Nazi crimes. Historians access captured German documents, interview survivors, analyse the extensive paper trail the German military bureaucracy left behind. The clean Wehrmacht myth begins to crack as researchers document systematic cooperation between Wehrmacht and SS, military orders authorising reprisals and collective punishments, general officers issuing commands that violated laws of war. Blaskowitz's case receives attention as example of protest, but also as example of how ineffective that protest was. Historians note that he filed detailed memoranda documenting crimes, that higher authorities ignored those protests, and that he continued serving competently for 6 more years. The scholarship becomes more sophisticated about moral ambiguity. Blaskowitz wasn't war criminal in sense of ordering atrocities, but neither was he resistor in sense of obstructing them. He occupied uncomfortable middle ground between perpetrator and opponent. 1980s and 90s witnessed major shift in understanding Wehrmacht's role in Holocaust. The Wehrmacht exhibition, controversial travelling display in Germany, presents extensive documentation of army participation in genocide. Photographs of Wehrmacht soldiers watching SS executions, orders from generals authorising racial killing, after-action reports describing anti-partisan operations that murdered thousands of civilians. German public reacts with shock and denial. Many still believe their fathers and grandfathers fought honourable war, while only SS committed crimes. But the documentary evidence is overwhelming and impossible to refute. Wehrmacht wasn't peripheral to Holocaust but integral to it, providing security, transportation, intelligence, and sometimes personnel for mass murder operations. The number of Wehrmacht divisions whose personnel participated in or supported anti-Jewish operations reaches into hundreds. The idea that army fought clean while SS got dirty becomes historically untenable. In this context of revised understanding, Blaskowitz's legacy becomes more complicated. His memoranda still document that he recognized crimes and protested them, which distinguishes him from the vast majority of Wehrmacht generals who said nothing. But his protests also reveal limitations of moral action within institutional framework. He filed complaints through proper channels and accomplished nothing. He documented atrocities and received professional punishment for his trouble. He continued serving after protests failed, which raises the question, if protest without result doesn't absolve continued service, what value did the protest have? Historians debate whether Blaskowitz should be praised for trying to work within system or criticised for not recognising that system was designed to produce atrocities, that effective resistance required breaking the system rather than filing complaints within it. 2000s bring more nuanced assessment balancing Blaskowitz's protest with his limits. Academic consensus recognises that he demonstrated moral awareness unusual among Wehrmacht generals, that his memoranda proved generals knew about crimes from the earliest stages, that his professional punishment proved the regime rejected military protests about SS operations. But scholars also note that moral awareness without action beyond protest ultimately changed nothing, that his continued service enabled the regime he opposed, that professional competence applied to Nazi objectives made him complicit in outcomes regardless of personal objections. Blaskowitz is judged neither hero nor war criminal, but something more complex. An officer whose traditional Prussian military code provided just enough moral framework to recognize crimes, but not enough to require effective resistance. Modern German military education uses Blaskowitz's case in officer ethics training, presenting his memoranda alongside his continued service and asking cadets to evaluate his choices. The discussion questions are pointed. Was filing protests through channels sufficient when those protests were ignored? Does continued professional service become complicity, even when personally opposing regime policies? At what point does duty to serve become duty to refuse service? Where is the line between soldier and enabler? The Bundeswehr, modern German military, approaches these questions carefully because they implicate the entire Wehrmacht officer corps. If Blaskowitz's continued service was wrong, then virtually every Wehrmacht general was guilty. If his service was acceptable, then following orders becomes viable defense. The teaching goal is not to provide clear answers, but to force officers to think about moral responsibility that transcends orders and hierarchy. The naming controversies reveal ongoing disputes about Blaskowitz's legacy. In 1960s, some German military barracks were named after Wehrmacht generals considered politically acceptable, including Blaskowitz. The naming honoured his protests while overlooking his continued service. By 1990s, as scholarship documented Wehrmacht's extensive involvement in atrocities, these namings became controversial. How can the military honour generals who served Nazi regime regardless of personal protests? The Bundeswehr eventually removed most Wehrmacht generals' names from barracks, including Blaskowitz's, recognising that continued service to criminal regime outweighs formal protests. The decision reflects consensus that moral courage requires more than documentation. It requires action that might cost everything, including career, freedom, and life. Three competing interpretations of Blaskowitz persist in historical literature and public memory. The hero narrative, popular in immediate post-war period and still found in some German conservative circles, portrays him as good man in impossible circumstances who did what he could within constraints of military hierarchy and personal oath. This interpretation emphasizes his memoranda, his career punishment, his apolitical professionalism, presenting him as example that not all Wehrmacht generals were Nazis or war criminals. The complicit professional narrative, dominant in academic scholarship since 1980s, acknowledges his protests but emphasizes his continued service, arguing that competent military service strengthened the regime regardless of personal objections, that protest without resistance enabled crimes it claimed to oppose. The tragic figure narrative, increasingly common since 2000s, sees Blaskowitz as someone trapped by military code that was adequate for previous era but catastrophically inadequate for Nazi period, someone whose Prussian honour required both protesting crimes and continuing to serve, creating moral contradiction he couldn't resolve, and that ultimately killed him. The comparative assessment with other Wehrmacht generals illuminates Blaskowitz's unique position. Field Marshal Rommel is mythologized as a apolitical professional who turned against Hitler, though evidence suggests his resistance was limited and primarily motivated by recognition that Germany was losing. Field Marshal Manstein, convicted of war crimes, wrote post-war memoirs justifying his Eastern Front commands and claiming ignorance of Holocaust despite documented evidence of cooperation with SS. General Heinz Guderian wrote technical military histories that ignored Nazi atrocities entirely, presenting Wehrmacht as purely military organisation. Admiral Karl Dönitz served 10 years for war crimes but never acknowledged moral responsibility, maintaining until his death that he'd merely served Germany honourably. Against these patterns of denial, justification, and mythologization, Blaskowitz's memoranda stand out. Here is documented contemporaneous evidence of a general recognizing crimes and protesting them. He didn't write those memoranda after the war to create alibi. He wrote them during the crimes, risking career to demand they stop. But the memoranda also reveal the tragedy of institutional loyalty overwhelming moral imperative. Blaskowitz's protests operated entirely within military framework. He argued atrocities violated military discipline, harmed operational security, damaged morale. He never argued they violated human rights or basic morality, never questioned Nazi racial ideology as morally wrong, never suggested that crimes of this magnitude required breaking his oath and refusing service. His moral vocabulary was limited to professional military concerns, and when those professional arguments failed to change policy, he had no other framework for resistance. The Prussian Code that made him protest in 1939 also made him continue serving through 1945, because that code prioritized duty and obedience over individual moral judgment. He was trapped by worldview that made him see crimes but couldn't make him stop enabling them. The final question: Blaskowitz's life and death race remains unresolved because it's fundamentally unanswerable. What is the value of protest without resistance? He documented crimes that higher authorities knew about and ignored. He filed memoranda that changed no policies and saved no lives. He continued serving the regime, committing the crimes he documented. Did his protests matter at all, except as evidence for historians decades later? Would total silence have been morally equivalent if followed by identical continued service? Or did protest itself have value even when ineffective? Moral witness even without practical results? Documentation even when unheeded? These questions have no definitive answer because they depend on whether we judge moral worth by intentions or outcomes, by efforts or results, by individual conscience or collective impact. Present day. Johannes Blaskowitz's memoranda are available online, digitized from archives, readable by anyone interested in Wehrmacht's relationship with Holocaust. They're cited in academic articles, taught in military ethics courses, referenced in documentaries about Nazi period. His name appears in encyclopedias and history books, usually with brief notation. German general who protested SS atrocities in Poland. What's usually omitted is the rest of the story. The protests failed. He continued serving for 6 years. He commanded armies while genocide unfolded. He committed suicide, rather than face judgment for choices he couldn't explain or defend. The full story is more complex and more troubling than simple hero narrative, revealing not a good man standing against evil, but a professional soldier whose professional code proved inadequate for confronting systemic evil, whose protests documented crimes without preventing them, whose continued service enabled the regime his conscience opposed. The judgment history renders is necessarily mixed and probably permanent. Blaskowitz was better than most Wehrmacht generals because he protested, worse than necessary because he continued serving, representative of the military institution's moral bankruptcy, because he thought protest without resistance was sufficient. He documented the beginning of Holocaust and spent the rest of the war enabling its continuation. He spoke truth to power and then continued serving power after truth was rejected. He maintained professional standards while serving criminal regime, believing that professional duty transcended moral evaluation of the cause served. His memoranda represent conscience. His continued service represents complicity. His suicide represents the unbearable contradiction between them. He was neither hero nor monster, but something more common and more tragic. A decent man whose decent instincts operated within an indecent system, whose professional excellence served evil purposes, whose moral courage extended to documentation but not to defiance. We remember him not because he stopped anything, but because he saw clearly and said so, and then kept serving anyway, and finally couldn't live with what that service meant. The question with which we end is the question Blaskowitz never answered, the question his suicide avoided. He protested, he documented, he continued serving, he died by his own hand. Was Johannes Blaskowitz a good man? History provides no simple verdict, because the question assumes a binary that Blaskowitz's life refuses. He was a Prussian officer in an era when Prussian honor codes became tools of genocide, a professional soldier whose professionalism enabled atrocity, a moral man whose morality stopped at the boundaries of duty and obedience. He saw evil clearly enough to name it, but not clearly enough to defy it. He preserved his conscience through protest, but sacrificed it through service. He was, in the end, a mirror in which each generation sees its own questions about complicity, collaboration, and the limits of institutional duty. And the man in that mirror, like the real Johannes Blaskowitz, offers no comfortable answers. only the disturbing reminder that good intentions, professional competence, and even moral protest mean nothing without courage to resist, when resistance is required